Rome marched in believing the battle ahead would be decided by numbers alone, but long before the first movement, Hannibal was already waiting. Welcome, and thank you for being here. As you settle in, feel free to leave a comment sharing where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. This is a calm, unhurried journey into one of history's most studied battles, told slowly and gently, as we step back into the ancient world and the quiet moments that led Rome forward and Hannibal to stillness. In the years leading up to the Battle of Cannae, Rome saw itself not merely as a city or even a republic, but as a force that had learned to expect victory through persistence alone. And this expectation had been shaped over generations of steady expansion, disciplined organization, and a deeply ingrained belief that endurance would eventually wear down any opponent. Rome was not a society that prized subtlety in warfare as much as it prized reliability, repetition, and collective effort. And its armies reflected this mindset in both structure and spirit, built from citizens who were trained to hold formation, to advance steadily, and to trust that unity would overcome uncertainty. And by the time Hannibal entered Italy, Rome had already weathered countless conflicts that reinforced its confidence, from regional struggles in the Italian peninsula to wars that tested but ultimately strengthened its political and military systems. And each challenge reinforced a cultural lesson that Rome internalized deeply, that no single defeat truly mattered so long as Rome continued to move forward, raise new legions, and confront the problem head-on. This mindset shaped how Roman leaders thought about war, not as a delicate balance of timing and terrain, but as a process, something that unfolded through pressure, numbers, and resolve. And it is important to understand that by the time Cannae approached, Rome did not see itself as reckless or arrogant, but as experienced, tested, and grounded in a method that had worked again and again, a method that told them that bold engagement was not only acceptable but necessary, and that hesitation was more dangerous than action. The Roman political system reinforced this belief, rewarding commanders who demonstrated decisiveness and confidence, while often viewing caution as weakness, and the annual rotation of consuls encouraged swift action, as each leader knew their time in command was limited, and that legacy was often shaped by visible results rather than careful restraint. And this rhythm of leadership, steady and predictable, created an environment where Rome felt most comfortable when marching forward, when formations were clear, when objectives were direct, and when the solution to resistance was pressure applied with greater force. The Roman army itself was an extension of Roman society, composed of citizens who were accustomed to structure, law, and collective responsibility. And when they assembled into legions, they carried with them not only weapons and armor, but assumptions that discipline would hold, that courage would spread through the ranks, and that the enemy, however clever, would eventually break under sustained advance. And in the years before Cannae, these assumptions had not yet failed Rome, in a way that forced deep reflection, even earlier encounters with Hannibal, while unsettling, were framed as temporary setbacks rather than warnings of a fundamentally different approach to war. And so Rome continued to believe that the answer lay not in rethinking its method, but in applying it more decisively, with more men, more resolve, and fewer delays. This belief was reinforced by Rome's extraordinary capacity to mobilize, drawing from a vast pool of manpower across allied territories. And this numerical advantage created a sense of inevitability, a quiet confidence that no matter how skilled Hannibal might be, he was still operating within Italy, surrounded by a system that could replenish losses and absorb shocks. And thus the question for Rome was not whether Hannibal could be defeated, but when, and more importantly, where the final confrontation would take place. Rome did not approach Cannae seeking a clever maneuver or a drawn-out campaign of positioning, but rather a conclusion, a moment where accumulated strength could be applied directly, decisively, and visibly. And this desire for resolution shaped every decision leading up to the battle, from the gathering of an unusually large army to the choice of terrain that seemed to favour Roman infantry tactics. And in this context, Rome's confidence was not reckless bravado, but a deeply held faith in a system that had defined Roman success for centuries. A faith that marching forward was not just a tactical choice, but a cultural instinct. And as the legions assembled and prepared to move toward Hannibal, they did so with the quiet certainty that they were walking toward a familiar outcome, one where pressure would be applied, resistance would collapse, and Rome would once again demonstrate that persistence, more than cunning, shaped the destiny of empires. And it was within this atmosphere of confidence, expectation, and forward motion that Rome marched toward Cannae, unaware that their very certainty was being observed, measured, and patiently awaited by a commander who understood that momentum, once committed, is often the hardest thing to stop. Hannibal's presence at Cannae was not the result of chance or sudden opportunity, but the quiet conclusion of a journey that had begun many years earlier, shaped by memory, patience, and a deep familiarity with Rome's habits. And to understand why Hannibal was waiting while Rome marched forward, it helps to slow down and consider how Hannibal himself came to think about war, not as a sequence of bold clashes, but as a long conversation with time, terrain, and human expectation. From a young age, Hannibal had been immersed in a world where Rome was not an abstract rival, but a constant presence, spoken of not with fear, but with careful attention, and he grew up learning that Rome was powerful not because of brilliance in any single moment, but because of its ability to persist, to recover, and to continue applying pressure even after losses. And this understanding shaped Hannibal's thinking in a way that differed subtly but significantly from many of his contemporaries, because rather than seeking a single dramatic gesture to defeat Rome outright, he learned to look for moments where Rome's strength could be guided, redirected, and eventually turned inward. Hannibal's early experiences in Iberia reinforced this approach, as he observed how different peoples fought, how morale shifted slowly rather than instantly, and how control of movement often mattered more than control of space. And by the time he assumed command, he had already begun to view war as something that unfolded over months and years rather than days. And this long view became especially important once he committed to the bold but carefully considered decision to carry the war into Italy itself. The crossing of the Alps, often remembered for its drama, was not simply an act of daring, but a deliberate disruption of Roman expectation, because Rome was accustomed to facing enemies who approached along familiar routes, through known territories, and according to established rhythms, and Hannibal's arrival from an unexpected direction was less about surprise in the moment and more about planting uncertainty that would linger, quietly influencing Roman decisions long after the initial shock faded. Once in Italy, Hannibal did not rush toward Rome, nor did he attempt to force decisive engagements on unfavourable terms, but instead moved deliberately through the countryside, observing how Roman commanders reacted, how quickly they mobilized, and how they responded to pressure. And in these movements, Hannibal gathered information not through spies alone, but through patterns, through watching how Rome pursued him, where it hesitated, and where it pressed forward without pause. Battles like Trebia and Lake Trasimene were not isolated victories, but chapters in a longer study, moments where Hannibal tested Roman assumptions and confirmed his understanding of how Roman armies behaved when they believed they had an advantage. And with each encounter, Hannibal refined his sense of timing, learning when to provoke movement and when to remain still, when to offer retreat and when to deny space. And this patience was not passive but active, a form of control exercised through restraint rather than force. As the months passed and Hannibal remained undefeated in Italy, Rome's frustration grew steadily, not explosively but persistently, and this frustration translated into pressure on Roman leadership to end the war decisively, to stop responding and start concluding. And Hannibal understood this dynamic well, because he knew that Rome's greatest discomfort was not loss itself but uncertainty, the feeling that momentum had slipped out of reach. And so Hannibal continued to move just enough to remain present, to remain relevant, and to remain unresolved. His army, diverse in origin and experience, became accustomed to this rhythm, learning to trust Hannibal's judgment even when action was delayed. And this trust was crucial, because it allowed Hannibal to hold his forces together over long periods without the constant reinforcement that Rome enjoyed. And it fostered a shared understanding that waiting was not weakness, but preparation. By the time Hannibal approached Cannae, he had spent years observing how Roman armies assembled, how they advanced, and how they interpreted signs of success. And he had seen repeatedly that when Romans believed an enemy was yielding, they pressed harder rather than pausing, narrowing their focus until forward movement itself became the objective. And this insight shaped Hannibal's thinking more than any single tactical diagram ever could, because it taught him that Rome's confidence followed predictable paths, and that those paths could be shaped gently, almost imperceptibly, by offering the right kind of resistance at the right moment. Cannae, then, was not chosen as a stage for a clever trick, but as a place where Hannibal could finally bring together everything he had learned about Rome's habits, its confidence, and its reliance on momentum, and the location offered the space needed to allow Rome to advance fully, to commit deeply, and to feel comfortable doing so. And Hannibal's long road to Italy had prepared him for this moment, not by hardening him toward violence, but by sharpening his awareness of timing, patience, and human behavior. While Rome marched toward Cannae, believing it was approaching a decisive resolution, Hannibal approached the same field with a different mindset entirely, one shaped by years of waiting, watching, and learning, where victory was not something seized suddenly, but something allowed to form gradually as the opponent moved exactly as expected. And in this way, Hannibal's journey to Italy was not a march, but a quiet unfolding, a preparation for a moment where stillness would matter more than speed, and where waiting would prove to be the most decisive action of all. As Hannibal remained in Italy, and the months stretched into years, Rome's response slowly shifted from measured concern to a quiet but persistent urgency, not the kind that erupts suddenly, but the kind that settles into conversations, speeches, and expectations, shaping decisions long before they are formally made. And this urgency was rooted not simply in fear of Hannibal, but in Rome's deep discomfort with unresolved problems, because Rome was a society built on resolution, on the idea that challenges were meant to be confronted directly and concluded through effort and endurance. And the longer Hannibal remained undefeated, the more his presence disrupted Rome's sense of order, not because Rome believed itself weak, but because the war no longer followed familiar patterns. Each campaigning season that passed without a decisive Roman victory added weight to the belief that something more was required, that the war needed to be finished in a way that reaffirmed Rome's understanding of itself. And this belief found expression in political pressure, as senators, citizens, and allied communities all looked toward Rome's leaders for reassurance that the situation remained under control. In this atmosphere, the idea of a single, overwhelming confrontation began to take shape, not as a reckless gamble, but as a logical extension of Rome's long-standing approach to warfare, which emphasized mass, discipline, and the steady application of force. And to many in Rome, the answer seemed clear, that Hannibal's earlier successes were not signs of an insurmountable opponent, but of an enemy who had not yet faced the full weight of Roman strength assembled in one place. This thinking was reinforced by Rome's remarkable ability to mobilize. As new legions were raised, allies contributed troops, and the sheer scale of the army being assembled began to feel like a solution in itself. A visible reassurance that Rome still possessed the capacity to impose its will when it chose to do so. The decision to commit such a large force was not made lightly, but it emerged gradually from a consensus that the war had reached a point where waiting no longer felt acceptable, and where delay was increasingly interpreted as hesitation rather than strategy. And in a political culture where leaders were expected to act decisively, the pressure to bring matters to a head became difficult to resist. The structure of Roman command also played a role, as the system of annually elected consuls meant that leadership rotated frequently, and each new commander faced the temptation to distinguish themselves through action, to be remembered not as caretakers of an ongoing conflict, but as the ones who brought it to an end. And this natural human desire for resolution and recognition blended seamlessly with Rome's broader cultural narrative, creating a powerful momentum toward confrontation. When Rome chose to gather one of the largest armies it had ever fielded, it did so with the intention of removing uncertainty, of forcing Hannibal into a situation where numbers, formation, and discipline would finally prevail. And the very size of the army carried its own psychological weight, reinforcing the belief that such strength could not be denied victory if applied directly. The choice of where to engage Hannibal reflected this mindset as well, as Roman leaders favoured terrain that appeared to support their infantry-heavy formations, open enough to allow manoeuvre, yet familiar enough to feel manageable, and Cannae, with its broad plains and proximity to supply routes, fit this vision comfortably, offering a setting where Rome could deploy its forces fully and press forward without feeling constrained. There was also an unspoken desire to restore balance to the war's narrative, to demonstrate to allies and adversaries alike that Rome still dictated the terms of conflict, and a decisive victory would serve not only military goals, but political and psychological ones as well, reaffirming Rome's role as the central authority in Italy. Throughout these preparations, Rome did not ignore Hannibal's abilities, but it interpreted them through its own framework, viewing him as a skilled commander who had succeeded through opportunism and movement, but who would ultimately be overwhelmed once Rome applied sufficient pressure in a single, sustained effort. And this interpretation allowed Roman leaders to feel confident that the decision to seek a decisive battle was not rash, but prudent, a return to fundamentals rather than a departure from them. The army that marched toward Cannae did so with a sense of purpose that was calm rather than anxious, grounded in the belief that the war had reached its natural conclusion and that all that remained was to execute a plan that aligned with Rome's strengths and even the presence of dual consuls, each bringing their own perspective, did little to disrupt this shared expectation, because both operated within the same cultural framework that valued decisive action and forward movement. In this way, the decision to end the war in one battle was not a single choice made in isolation, but the culmination of months of accumulated pressure, reinforced by tradition, politics, and a collective desire for closure. And as Rome marched toward Cannae, it did so not in a state of reckless confidence, but in a quiet, settled belief that this was the moment when uncertainty would finally give way to resolution, unaware that the very clarity it sought was being gently shaped by an opponent who understood that when an army commits fully to an outcome, it often becomes least capable of adjusting when that outcome begins to slip away. The place where armies meet often carries its own quiet influence long before the first movement begins, and the plain near Cannae was one such landscape, unassuming at first glance, yet deeply consequential in how it shaped the decisions, expectations, and eventual outcomes of those who stood upon it. Because Cannae was not a dramatic battlefield marked by steep hills or narrow passes, but a wide, open stretch of land in southern Italy, near the winding course of the Aufidus River, where space itself seemed generous and forgiving, and it was precisely this openness that appealed so strongly to Roman sensibilities, as the Roman army favoured terrain where its formations could deploy fully, where lines could be maintained, and where the collective weight of disciplined infantry could be brought to bear without obstruction. The plain allowed for clarity, for visibility, and for the reassuring sense that nothing was hidden, and to Roman commanders, this openness felt like fairness, a neutral ground where strength could speak plainly and without complication. And this perception mattered deeply, because Rome trusted landscapes that did not demand subtlety, places where success seemed to depend more on resolve than on interpretation. The Aufidus River itself flowed nearby, providing a source of water but also contributing to the character of the ground, as the surrounding soil could be dry and dusty, especially under the summer sun. And while this might seem like a minor detail, the heat and dust of southern Italy played a quiet role in shaping how armies moved, breathed, and maintained cohesion over long hours, and the Romans, accustomed to campaigning in such conditions, saw nothing unusual in this, interpreting familiarity as advantage. Hannibal, however, viewed the same landscape through a different lens, not as a neutral stage, but as a space filled with subtle possibilities, where openness could be used not merely to advance, but to draw an enemy forward, and where the absence of obstacles meant that movement, once begun, could be guided rather than blocked. From Hannibal's perspective, the plain offered room for Rome to commit fully, to extend its formation, and to press inward with confidence. And it also allowed Hannibal the flexibility to arrange his forces in a way that responded dynamically to Roman movement, rather than resisting it outright. The wind patterns across the plain, often overlooked in broader accounts, were also considered carefully, as the prevailing winds could carry dust toward advancing forces, subtly affecting visibility and comfort. And while Hannibal did not rely on this alone, it was another small factor that he understood and accepted as part of the environment, something that could gently reinforce the broader plan rather than dictate it. The terrain near Cannae also lacked natural barriers that might limit retreat or advance, which to the Romans felt like freedom of movement, a reassurance that they could adjust as needed. But to Hannibal, this same openness meant that once Rome advanced deeply, there would be little to interrupt the momentum of that movement, allowing it to continue until space itself became constrained by the formations on either side. The plain thus became a kind of quiet amplifier, not of noise or spectacle, but of intent, magnifying the choices made by each commander. And because Rome intended to press forward decisively, the landscape promised to support that intention fully, without interference. And this alignment between intention and environment strengthened Roman confidence, reinforcing the belief that the battlefield favoured them. Hannibal, meanwhile, was less concerned with whether the land favoured one side or the other, and more interested in how it would shape behaviour, because he understood that armies do not move simply according to orders, but according to what feels possible and comfortable in the moment. And on the plain of Cannae, forward movement felt natural, almost inevitable, especially for an army that believed in momentum. The river, running along one side of the field, provided a subtle boundary that influenced how formations aligned, gently shaping the direction of movement without forcing it. And Hannibal accounted for this as well, understanding that natural features need not block an army to influence it, that simply being present could guide decisions in quiet ways. The openness of the terrain also meant that the battle would unfold under full view, without hidden maneuvers or sudden surprises, and this transparency suited Rome's expectations, as Roman commanders trusted what they could see and measure, believing that visibility equated to control, and this belief reduced the perceived need for caution, as nothing appeared concealed or ambiguous. Hannibal, however, did not rely on concealment, but on anticipation, and the landscape allowed him to arrange his forces in a way that appeared straightforward, even inviting, offering Rome exactly the kind of battlefield it believed it needed to bring the war to an end. The plain thus became a shared space, interpreted in two very different ways, one side seeing confirmation of its strength, the other seeing an opportunity to guide that strength into a predictable pattern. And this difference in interpretation mattered more than any single feature of the land itself. As the Roman army assembled and took its place on the field, the terrain seemed to affirm their expectations, wide enough to deploy fully, familiar enough to feel manageable, and open enough to promise a clear outcome. And this sense of alignment between plan and place allowed Roman leaders to feel settled, confident that they were not walking into uncertainty, but into resolution. Hannibal, standing on the same ground, saw not a promise of clarity, but a canvas, a space where the enemy's intentions could be allowed to unfold fully, where movement could be absorbed rather than resisted, and where patience could shape the battle long before any decisive moment arrived. The landscape of Cannae did not decide the battle on its own, but it played its part by offering both sides what they expected, and in doing so, it revealed how much expectations themselves shape outcomes. Because when an army feels comfortable in its surroundings, it often stops questioning its direction, and it was within this quiet comfort, under the open sky of southern Italy, that Rome prepared to march forward, believing the land would support its advance, while Hannibal waited, understanding that the openness of the field was not an obstacle to his plan, but one of its most essential elements. Hannibal's army at Cannae was a mosaic of cultures, languages, and fighting traditions, and to understand why Hannibal could wait calmly for Rome to march forward, it helps to slow down and explore how his forces were assembled, how they lived together, and why their value lay not in matching Rome man for man, but in the deep, shared experience that bound them, because Hannibal's soldiers were not gathered in a single levy before the battle, but had been with him for years, travelling with him across Spain, through the Alps, and into the heart of Italy, surviving winter hardships, battles won and lost, and long stretches of uncertain supply. And this history mattered profoundly, because armies develop a sense of self, not merely from the number of soldiers they contain, but from the stories they share, the struggles they endure, and the skills they trust in one another. And Hannibal's army embodied this truth, blending veteran African infantry, Iberian swordsmen, Gallic warriors, light-armed Balearic slingers, and two types of cavalry into a single cohesive force that could move, fight, and respond as one, even when composed of disparate parts. The core of Hannibal's infantry were African soldiers, seasoned in the wars of Carthage, disciplined in formation, and skilled in close combat. And while their numbers were smaller than those of a Roman legion, their experience and confidence in Hannibal's leadership gave them a steadiness that allowed them to hold a line under pressure or to pivot inward when required. And next to them stood troops from Iberia, famous for their agility and D. Ferocity, accustomed to rapid advances and quick withdrawals, perfectly suited for the kind of controlled retreat that Hannibal would employ in the centre of his line at Cannae. Alongside these veterans marched Gauls from northern Italy, larger in physique and often more impetuous in temperament, who had joined Hannibal out of shared grievances against Rome and who brought a different energy to the army, one that Hannibal harnessed carefully, positioning them in the centre at Cannae to absorb the initial Roman attack while giving them enough space to retreat in a way that felt more like yielding than fleeing. And while some might see the Gauls' less disciplined style as a weakness, Hannibal understood that their willingness to charge and then bend under pressure was exactly what was needed to draw the Romans deeper into his formation. The Balearic slingers, hailing from the islands off Spain, offered yet another skill set, adept at launching stones with precision and force from a distance, softening enemy ranks before close combat ensued, and their role, though less visible in the larger narrative, contributed to Hannibal's overall control of space and timing. The cavalry, divided between Numidian horsemen and heavier Iberian and Gallic riders, added a dynamic range of options that Rome could not match, because the Numidians, lightly armoured and mounted on swift horses, excelled at harassment, feints, and rapid flanking manoeuvres, while the heavier cavalry could engage decisively or pursue a retreating enemy. And these mounted troops were crucial in Cannae for delivering the blows that would close the Roman army in from the rear once the infantry had been enveloped. Beyond their individual skills, what made Hannibal's army remarkable was the way these disparate elements were integrated, not through uniformity, but through trust and mutual benefit, and that trust was built over years of campaigning, where soldiers learned that Hannibal did not waste their lives, that his patience and awareness saved them as often as his boldness delivered victory. And this trust allowed Hannibal to deploy them with confidence, knowing that their loyalty was not dependent on immediate gratification, but on a long-standing relationship of respect. This mixture of experience and expectation created an army that was small enough to move quickly, yet diverse enough to adjust to different terrains and enemies, and it stood in contrast to the Roman army, which was larger and more uniform, but less flexible in its tactics. And this contrast mattered at Cannae, because it meant Hannibal's soldiers were not simply waiting to see if Rome would break, but were prepared for a sequence of actions that they had practiced, discussed, and believed in. The African veterans on the flanks knew that when the moment came, they would need to pivot inward confidently, not in panic, but in deliberate motion, and the Iberians and Gauls in the centre understood that retreating was part of the plan, not a failure, and that their temporary backward step would create the space needed for the double envelopment. The cavalry knew that their initial task was to clear the Roman horse away, not or glory, but to ensure that the infantry could be surrounded without interference, and once that was done, they had to swing around to the rear of the Roman formation, sealing off the last avenue of escape. And all of this required coordination that came only from shared experience and mutual trust, because in the chaos of battle, it is easy for one group to act too soon or too late, if it does not believe that the others will do their part. Beyond tactics, there was also the psychological resilience that comes from surviving hardship together, and Hannibal's soldiers had endured hunger, cold, and the fear of being cut off far from home, and these shared trials created a bond that numbers alone cannot replicate, because when men have faced death together and survived, they gain confidence not only in their leader but in one another, and this confidence allowed Hannibal's army to remain calm even when outnumbered, to wait patiently on the plain at Cannae as Rome marched forward with tens of thousands of soldiers, and to know that if they held their nerve, the plan they had practiced would unfold. Critics of Hannibal often wonder why he chose not to reinforce his army with more recruits, but to Hannibal, quality mattered more than quantity, because he understood that adding untested troops in the midst of a campaign could disrupt cohesion and trust, and he preferred to rely on those who had already proven their ability to work together, and this principle shaped his approach to alliances as well, because he treated his allies not as disposable auxiliaries, but as integral parts of his force, respecting their customs and ensuring that their contributions were acknowledged. And this respect fostered loyalty that extended beyond simple contracts or pay, creating a coalition army that held together not by fear but by choice. The logistical reality of sustaining this army across Italy also speaks to the importance of experience, because Hannibal's soldiers had learned to forage, to conserve, and to move quickly when necessary, and these skills allowed them to survive in hostile territory without relying on long supply lines. And this independence further reinforced their confidence, because they did not depend on the immediate arrival of resources to fight. And this autonomy was especially important at Cannae, where Hannibal needed his troops to focus on their roles rather than worry about the length of the campaign. The cultural diversity of the army could have been a source of division, but Hannibal turned it into a strength by assigning roles that suited each group's natural inclinations, and by fostering a sense of shared purpose that transcended tribal or national identities. And when men see that their unique skills are valued and that they contribute to a larger plan, they are more willing to cooperate. And this sense of contribution was crucial at Cannae, where every group had a specific role that was essential to the overall strategy. The experience of Hannibal's army also extended to command structure, because his officers were not merely appointed for political reasons, but were chosen based on competence and loyalty, and many of them, like Hannibal, the cavalry commander, had been with Hannibal since the beginning, and their relationships with the troops helped to maintain order and morale. And when orders were given on the field, there was no confusion about authority or intent, because the chain of command was clear and trusted. The advantage of such an army at Cannae was not visible in terms of numbers, but in the fluidity with which it could respond to the Romans' advance, bending where Rome pushed, stiffening where needed, and then closing in precisely when the time was right. And this fluidity came from years of shared experience, from a mutual understanding of how to fight as one despite differences in weapons and languages, and from a deep belief that their commander's patience was as important as his courage. When Hannibal's soldiers stood on the plain at Cannae, they did not count how many Romans were facing them, nor did they fret about the outcome if they followed the plan, because they had learned that discipline and experience could overcome numbers, and that their strength lay not in meeting the Romans head-on, but in guiding them into a position where the Romans' own momentum would become a trap. This belief allowed them to execute a complex maneuver under intense pressure without breaking, and as the Romans pressed forward, the Gauls and Iberians in the centre withdrew in a controlled manner. The Africans on the flanks pivoted inward, and the cavalry swung around to strike from behind, and in that moment the years of marching, fighting, and surviving together coalesced into a single, fluid movement that turned the open plain into a cage. And Hannibal's army, though smaller, demonstrated that experience and cohesion could accomplish what sheer numbers could not, and it was this quiet power, built over time and rooted in trust, that allowed Hannibal to wait confidently for Rome to march in, knowing that his army, though outnumbered, was ready to enact a plan that relied not on speed or surprise, but on patience, timing, and the deep connection between soldiers who had learned to fight as one. As the sun rose gently over the plain of Cannae, its light softened by the haze of dust and early mist, both armies stirred in quiet routine rather than frantic preparation, and the tone of the morning was far more subdued than later accounts often suggest, because soldiers who have seen many battles know that the hours before the clash are usually marked by repetition, careful attention to equipment, and a kind of resigned calm. And on this particular day in late summer, the atmosphere was shaped as much by habit as by expectation. Hannibal's camp, smaller than Rome's but deeply experienced, moved through practiced motions with officers checking weaponry, ensuring that shields were strapped securely, and repeating instructions that had been delivered the previous evening. And while there was tension in the air, it was not frantic but focused, as men sharpened swords, checked the fit of helmets, and quietly shared water and bread, and their conversations, where they occurred, were often mundane, discussing family, memories of previous campaigns, or small jokes that offered momentary distraction, and this normalcy mattered because it prevented fear from spiraling, grounding the soldiers in routine rather than speculation. Hannibal himself moved among his officers, speaking in low tones, confirming that each understood the order of deployment and the timing of movements, not with dramatic gestures, but with the confidence of someone who had overseen such preparations many times, and his presence was both reassuring and purposeful, reminding his troops that their roles were part of a larger plan that had been thought through carefully. Nearby, the cavalry commanders organized their troops, inspecting horses, adjusting saddles, and reminding riders to stay alert for signals that would call them forward. And the light-armed infantry gathered stones for their slings, testing their range and adjusting their pouches, and the African veterans, standing by their long shields and short swords, quietly reviewed how they would pivot inward when the time came, each man knowing his place in the line. The Gauls and Iberians in the centre, who would face the first impact of the Roman advance, checked their shields and talked among themselves about pacing their retreat, reminding one another that moving backward was not a sign of defeat, but part of the design. And this understanding helped to ease the natural anxiety that comes with the idea of yielding ground, because men who retreat under pressure need to believe in the purpose of their movement. And Hannibal had ensured that they did. Across the plain, the Roman camp was larger and more bustling, as thousands of soldiers prepared to march forward, and the scale of their preparations created a different kind of morning energy, one marked by the sound of many voices, the clatter of armour being donned, and the movement of large formations forming up. And while there was discipline, there was also a sense of inevitability that gave the morning a slightly less deliberate tone than Hannibal's camp, because Rome's confidence in its method translated into straightforward readiness rather than careful reassessment. The Roman consuls, each commanding portions of the army on alternating days, had decided the evening before that they would deploy in deeper, denser formations than usual, arranging their infantry in columns that were narrower and longer, believing that this depth would break through Hannibal's centre with sheer weight, and so the soldiers were instructed to stand closer, to expect a sustained push forward, and to keep advancing until ordered to stop. And this instruction gave them a clear task that reduced room for doubt, because when expectations are clear, men feel more secure even if the plan is demanding. As the morning light grew stronger, the Roman cavalry formed on the flanks, with the heavier allied cavalry on the right near the river, and the Roman cavalry on the left. And they checked their horses and adjusted their armour with the same mix of routine and tension that marked any battle morning. And though they were outnumbered by Hannibal's cavalry, they believed that their task was simple: to hold the enemy at bay long enough for the infantry to achieve its objective. The sheer size of the Roman army created a logistical challenge, and quartermasters and servants moved among the ranks, distributing rations, checking that water containers were filled, and reminding soldiers to tie their sandals tightly to avoid stumbling in the dust. And these small tasks, while unremarkable, were essential to maintaining order and cohesion, and they gave soldiers something to focus on besides the looming confrontation. In both camps, priests and augurs performed quiet rituals, offering sacrifices and reading omens, because even in disciplined armies, the spiritual dimension of war was acknowledged, and men took comfort from signs interpreted by those they trusted, and these rituals were carried out calmly and privately, not as spectacles, but as personal and communal affirmations that they were part of something larger than themselves. As the sun climbed higher, the heat began to build, and both armies adjusted their preparations, ensuring that water was close at hand and that helmets were secure but not stifling, because soldiers understood that heat and thirst could sap strength as much as enemy weapons. And on this summer day, the climate would soon become another quiet factor shaping the battle, with dust rising from the ground as men marched and horses moved. And this dust, carried by the prevailing breeze, would drift toward the Roman lines as they advanced, subtly affecting visibility and comfort. Throughout the morning, messengers moved between commanders, confirming alignment, adjusting positions slightly to ensure that lines were straight, and reminding units of their place in the larger formation. And these adjustments were made calmly, without panic, because both armies understood that clarity before movement reduced confusion once battle began. The Roman infantry, arrayed in deep formations, stood in lines that stretched back many ranks, and the men at the front could see their Carthaginian counterparts in the distance, while those in the rear saw only the backs of their comrades and the banners that marked their cohort and this visua. Limitation meant that many Roman soldiers would experience the battle through the movements of those directly in front of them, trusting that orders would filter back and that their role was to push forward steadily. In contrast, Hannibal's formation, with a convex centre and concave flanks, allowed more of his soldiers to see the field, and while not everyone understood the entire plan, many could see the shape of their line and the space behind them, and this awareness contributed to their sense of control, because visibility often translates into confidence. As the moment of movement approached, both armies fell silent, not in dramatic hush but in a quiet focus born of discipline, and standard-bearers lifted their eagles. Horses pawed the ground gently, and commanders moved to their positions, raising their hands or sounding horns to signal readiness. And for a brief moment, the plain seemed suspended between calm and motion, with the heat shimmering slightly, dust beginning to rise, and the collective breath of tens of thousands of men drawn in, held, and released in anticipation. This morning at Cannae, though largely unremarkable in its individual details, was crucial because it set the tone for the battle, and it revealed how both Hannibal and Rome approached conflict, one with deliberate, rehearsed coordination among a smaller but experienced force, the other with confident preparation of a larger, deeply structured army, and the calm of this morning, free of dramatic speeches or chaotic last-minute changes, reflected a shared understanding that once the commands were given and the lines began to move, events would unfold according to habits, plans, and the subtle interplay between landscape, leadership, and the human capacity to act under pressure. And as the sun continued to rise, casting longer shadows and illuminating the wide plain, both armies took their final positions, and the stillness of the early hours gave way to the first sounds of movement, signalling that the moment of waiting was over and that the plan each had prepared was about to be tested on the open field of Cannae. When the first movements finally began at Cannae, they did not arrive suddenly or dramatically, but unfolded in a slow, deliberate manner that matched the calm certainty both armies carried into the day, And this initial phase of the battle was defined less by violence than by motion, alignment, and the quiet testing of expectations. As Rome began to advance and Hannibal continued to wait, allowing the shape of the encounter to reveal itself before intervening, the Roman infantry moved forward in dense formation, their shields held close, their pace measured rather than hurried. And this steady advance reflected their belief that progress itself was the key to victory, that by continuing forward without hesitation, they would eventually press through Hannibal's line and force a collapse. And as they moved, dust began to rise from the dry plain, stirred by thousands of sandals striking the ground in unison, creating a faint haze that softened outlines and reduced clarity at a distance. Though not enough to disrupt cohesion and the sound of movement, the collective rhythm of marching feet and clinking armor replaced the earlier stillness, marking a transition from preparation to commitment. Hannibal's forces responded not by rushing forward, but by holding their positions, allowing the Romans to close the distance. And this restraint was deliberate, because Hannibal understood that the Romans' confidence was reinforced by forward motion, and that interrupting it too early might cause hesitation or disorder, whereas allowing it to build would encourage deeper commitment. As the Roman lines approached, the Carthaginian skirmishers moved forward lightly, engaging briefly and then withdrawing, launching stones or light projectiles before retreating behind the main line. And this action served multiple purposes: testing Roman reactions, drawing them onward, and beginning the gradual shaping of the battlefield without revealing the broader intent. The Romans absorbed this initial contact with little concern, pressing onward as expected, because skirmishing was a familiar prelude rather than a sign of resistance, and their focus remained fixed on the main Carthaginian line ahead, which appeared slightly bowed outward, presenting a centre that seemed ready to give way under sustained pressure. This visual impression mattered greatly, because armies interpret shapes and movement instinctively, and the convex centre of Hannibal's line suggested vulnerability, reinforcing Roman confidence that they were advancing toward a weakness rather than a trap. As the distance closed further, the Roman infantry tightened their formation, their officers calling out reminders to keep pace, to maintain alignment, and to press forward steadily, and this tightening increased the density of their mass, which they believed would maximize their strength at the point of contact. And while this depth provided momentum, it also reduced lateral flexibility, a trade-off that Roman commanders accepted because they expected a frontal breakthrough rather than a prolonged engagement. Hannibal's centre, composed largely of Gauls and Iberians, stood ready to receive the Roman advance, and as contact began, they engaged with controlled aggression, meeting the Romans' forward push without resisting it too forcefully, allowing themselves to be pressed backward gradually, step by step, and this retreat was neither chaotic nor hurried, but measured, maintaining cohesion while yielding ground. And this behaviour was critical, because it confirmed Roman expectations that their advance was working, that Hannibal's line was buckling under pressure, and that continued effort would bring decisive results. The Romans, seeing the enemy give ground, responded exactly as Hannibal anticipated, pressing harder, compressing their ranks further, and pushing inward toward the apparent centre of resistance. And this inward pressure began to shape the Roman formation subtly but significantly, as the front ranks advanced into the space created by the retreating Carthaginian centre, while the rear ranks continued to push forward, narrowing the formation and drawing it deeper into the developing pocket. Throughout this process, the Carthaginian flanks, anchored by experienced African infantry, held their ground firmly, neither advancing nor retreating, creating a stable frame around the flexible centre. And this contrast between movement and stillness was intentional, because it allowed the center to bend while the flanks remained poised, ready to pivot inward when the moment was right. The Roman cavalry on the flanks engaged Hannibal's mounted forces as well, though these encounters unfolded largely outside the immediate awareness of the infantry pressing forward. And while the cavalry clashes were important, they did not yet alter the Romans' perception of the battle's progress, because the infantry engagement at the center dominated their attention and reinforced their belief that the battle was unfolding according to plan. The dust stirred by movement continued to thicken, carried by the breeze toward the Roman lines, and while it did not obscure vision completely, it added a layer of discomfort and uncertainty, making it harder to see the full shape of the Carthaginian formation. And this limited visibility further focused Roman attention on the immediate space ahead, reducing awareness of developments on the flanks. As time passed, the Romans' forward movement became more determined, driven by the sense that they were nearing a breakthrough, and this determination translated into increased pressure, with soldiers leaning into their shields, pushing with their bodies, and advancing in a continuous surge that felt purposeful and effective. Hannibal observed these movements closely, not intervening prematurely, because his plan depended on the Romans committing fully to the advance, and he understood that momentum, once established, is difficult to reverse, especially for an army structured to move forward collectively rather than to adjust laterally or withdraw. The Carthaginian center continued its controlled retreat, maintaining enough resistance to keep the Romans engaged, but yielding just enough ground to draw them deeper, and this delicate balance required discipline and trust, because any sudden collapse or overly aggressive resistance could disrupt the intended shape of the battle. But the experience of Hannibal's troops allowed them to execute this movement with precision. As the Romans advanced, their formation began to lose its original rectangular shape, narrowing at the front as more troops pressed inward, creating a bulge that extended further into the Carthaginian line. And while this configuration increased pressure at the point of contact, it also made the Romans more vulnerable to pressure from the sides, a vulnerability that was not yet apparent to those within the formation, because their focus remained fixed on the perceived success directly ahead. The initial phase of the battle thus unfolded not as a sudden clash, but as a gradual shaping of space and expectation, with Rome advancing steadily and Hannibal waiting patiently, allowing the Romans' own movements to define the conditions under which the decisive moment would occur. And this patience was central to Hannibal's strategy, because he understood that the most effective traps are those that appear indistinguishable from opportunity. And by the time the Romans began to sense that something was amiss, their momentum, density, and narrowed formation would make adjustment difficult. In these early hours, the Battle of Cannae was still quiet in its way, marked more by steady pressure and controlled movement than by chaos. And this quietness was deceptive, because beneath the surface of routine engagement, the foundations of Rome's position were being reshaped, guided by the very confidence that drove them forward. And as the Romans continued to march in, pressing ever deeper into the space Hannibal allowed them, the shape of the battle shifted slowly but irrevocably, setting the stage for the moments to come, when waiting would give way to action and the true intent of Hannibal's design would finally be revealed. As the Roman advance continued and the space between the two armies narrowed further, the true importance of shape, alignment, and gradual change began to assert itself, though not yet in a way that was obvious to those pressing forward, because the battle at Cannae was not defined by sudden reversals, but by slow transformations that unfolded almost invisibly within the mass of movement. And it was during this phase that Hannibal's design, patient and deliberate, began to take on its final form. The Carthaginian center, which had initially bowed outward toward the Romans, now appeared to bend more deeply inward as it absorbed the steady pressure, creating a concave shape that subtly altered the geometry of the battlefield. And this curvature was not accidental or improvised, but the result of careful planning and disciplined execution, because Hannibal had anticipated how the Romans would interpret retreat, and he relied on their confidence to push them further into the narrowing space. To the Roman soldiers in the front ranks, the sight of the enemy giving ground was reassuring rather than alarming, reinforcing the belief that their advance was succeeding. And this belief was communicated backward through the formation as officers and standard bearers urged their men onward, encouraging them to maintain pressure and cohesion. And as the Roman mass moved forward, its depth increased while its width diminished, creating a dense column that extended deep into the Carthaginian formation. And this density, while powerful in forward motion, reduced flexibility and awareness. Caused soldiers in the middle and rear could not easily see the flanks or understand how the broader battle was unfolding. Hannibal's African infantry on the flanks, meanwhile, remained steady and disciplined, holding their positions firmly and resisting the urge to engage prematurely. And their stillness was as important as the movement of the centre, because it created a stable frame within which the Romans were allowed to advance. And this contrast between motion and restraint shaped Roman perception, making it seem as though the Carthaginian line was collapsing only at its weakest point, rather than reorganizing itself around the Roman advance. The subtle inward pivot of the African infantry began almost imperceptibly, not as a sudden wheel or dramatic maneuver, but as a gradual adjustment of stance and orientation, with soldiers turning slightly toward the Roman flanks while maintaining their forward-facing posture. And this adjustment positioned them to apply pressure laterally when the time came. And because it occurred slowly and under the cover of ongoing engagement, it did not immediately register as a coordinated movement to those watching from a distance. At the same time, the Roman cavalry on the flanks was becoming increasingly engaged with Hannibal's mounted forces, and while the outcome of these clashes would prove decisive, the infantry at the centre remained largely unaware of developments beyond their immediate surroundings, because the noise, dust, and density of their formation limited communication and visibility. And this isolation reinforced their focus on the perceived success directly ahead, making it difficult for warnings or adjustments to travel through the ranks. The shape of the trap depended on this isolation, because Hannibal understood that an army divided in awareness is easier to guide than one that perceives the whole, and by allowing the Romans to concentrate their attention inward, he reduced their ability to respond to changes on the periphery. The Roman commanders, observing from positions that offered a broader view, may have noticed the deepening curve of the Carthaginian centre, but within the context of Roman expectations, this development still appeared consistent with a weakening enemy line, and the pressure to maintain momentum discouraged hesitation, because slowing or stopping the advance might suggest doubt, and doubt was something Roman leadership sought to avoid, especially in a battle intended to demonstrate decisiveness. As the Romans pressed forward, the distance between their flanks and the Carthaginian infantry narrowed steadily, and what had begun as an open engagement across a wide plain gradually transformed into a confined space where movement became more constrained. And this confinement was not the result of physical barriers, but of the convergence of forces, a narrowing corridor created by the Romans' own advance and the steady inward orientation of Hannibal's flanks. The African infantry, experienced and disciplined, waited for the moment when Roman momentum would carry them far enough forward that lateral pressure could be applied without risk. and this patience was crucial. B. Cause engaging too early might have allowed the Romans to adjust or withdraw, while waiting too long could have allowed the centre to collapse entirely. And Hannibal's understanding of timing, honed through years of observation, guided this balance with remarkable precision. The Gauls and Iberians in the centre continued their controlled retreat, their formation bending inward while maintaining cohesion, and their ability to do so depended on trust in the plan and confidence in the flanks, because retreat under pressure is one of the most psychologically challenging maneuvers for soldiers, requiring discipline and restraint in the face of apparent success by the enemy, and their success in maintaining this movement demonstrated the depth of experience within Hannibal's army. As the shape of the Carthaginian line transformed, the Roman formation responded instinctively, pressing inward to fill the space, and this response further increased density at the centre, creating a mass of men that was difficult to maneuver and increasingly reliant on forward pressure to maintain cohesion. And this reliance on momentum meant that slowing or reversing direction would be difficult even if the need became apparent. The shape of the trap thus emerged not as a sudden enclosure, but as a gradual tightening, a convergence of lines that transformed opportunity into constraint, and this transformation was subtle enough that many Roman soldiers likely did not realize what was happening until movement became restricted and space diminished, and by then their options were limited. Hannibal's role, E, during this phase, was not to intervene directly, but to observe and judge, adjusting the timing of his flank's inward movement and coordinating with his cavalry commanders through signals and messengers, ensuring that all elements of the plan progressed in harmony. And this coordination required calm and clarity under pressure, qualities that Hannibal possessed in abundance, and which allowed him to maintain control even as the battle intensified. The dust rising from the plain and the noise of engagement created a sensory environment that further obscured the evolving shape of the battle, making it difficult for individuals to perceive changes beyond their immediate vicinity. And this sensory limitation reinforced the trap, because it kept the Romans focused on the present moment rather than the broader pattern. As the hours passed and the Roman advance continued, the Carthaginian flanks were now positioned at angles that would allow them to apply pressure inward with maximum effect, and the centre had retreated just far enough to draw the Romans into the desired depth, creating a formation that was vulnerable from multiple directions. And this vulnerability was not yet fully exploited, but it was now firmly established, waiting for the signal that would transform containment into enclosure. The shape of the trap at Cannae was thus not defined by walls or sudden movements, but by the careful manipulation of space, momentum, and expectation, and it demonstrated how an army's own confidence can be used to guide it into a position of disadvantage, and as the Romans continued to press forward, convinced that victory lay just ahead, they were in fact stepping deeper into a narrowing space shaped by Hannibal's patience, where the next phase of the battle would unfold not as a surprise, but as the inevitable consequence of the movements they had already made. And in this way, the trap at Cannae took shape quietly, guided by waiting rather than rushing, and by the time it became visible to those within it, its form was already complete. By the time the battle at Cannae entered this phase, the Roman army was no longer simply advancing, it was committed, and this commitment expressed itself not through conscious decision but through momentum, the kind that builds gradually and becomes self-sustaining, making it difficult to pause, reflect, or adjust, and this momentum carried the Romans forward even as the conditions around them changed in subtle but important ways. The deepened advance into Hannibal's centre created a sense of progress that was reinforced by the physical sensation of movement, the steady push of bodies behind them, and the visual confirmation of enemy troops continuing to give ground. And for the individual Roman soldier, these cues were far more persuasive than distant signals or abstract concerns, because what mattered most in the moment was the pressure at one's back and the space opening ahead. And as long as that space existed, advancing felt natural and correct. The Roman formation, already deepened by design, now grew denser as soldiers pressed closer together to maintain cohesion in the narrowing corridor created by the Carthaginian retreat. And this density, while increasing forward force, reduced the ability of individuals and even small units to maneuver independently, making lateral movement difficult and turning the formation into a kind of moving mass rather than a flexible arrangement of cohorts. And this transformation was gradual enough that it did not immediately trigger alarm, because Roman soldiers were accustomed to fighting in close order and trusted that their office, RS, would manage the broader picture. Communication within the Roman ranks became more challenging as noise, dust, and physical proximity increased, with shouted orders often fading before reaching the rear, and visual signals obscured by the bodies and equipment of those in front. And, as a result, the Roman army increasingly relied on instinct and habit rather than direct instruction. And those instincts, honed through training and tradition, emphasized continued advance and sustained pressure. Hannibal had anticipated this reliance on habit, understanding that Roman discipline, while formidable, was also predictable, and that once the Romans committed to a forward push, they were unlikely to halt or redeploy unless confronted with an unmistakable crisis. And even then, the size and density of their formation would make such adjustments slow and difficult. The Carthaginian centre continued its controlled withdrawal, maintaining just enough resistance to prevent a sudden collapse while yielding ground in a way that felt earned by Roman effort. And this balance was crucial because it prevented the Romans from suspecting that the retreat was intentional, instead reinforcing the belief that victory was being achieved through perseverance. The Africans on the flanks, now angled inward more noticeably, applied increasing lateral pressure to the Roman formation. But this pressure was still subtle, felt more as a tightening of space than as a direct attack. And because the Romans were focused forward, many experienced this pressure as the natural compression of battle rather than it's a sign of encirclement. The cavalry engagements on the flanks were reaching decisive moments during this time, but their impact on the infantry's awareness remained limited, because the Roman infantry could not easily see or hear the outcome of these clashes, and even if news of cavalry setbacks filtered inward, it would have been difficult to interpret their significance in the midst of ongoing forward movement. The Roman commanders, positioned where they could observe more of the field, faced a complex challenge, because while they might have begun to sense that the shape of the battle was not unfolding exactly as expected, the momentum of their own formation limited their ability to intervene effectively, and issuing orders to halt, withdraw, or redeploy such a massive force under pressure would have required clarity, time, and space, all of which were in short supply. The deeper the Roman army pressed into the Carthaginian formation, the more its own shape transformed from a broad front into a protruding wedge, narrowing toward the point of contact and stretching back into the rear ranks. And this shape amplified the effects of lateral pressure, because forces pressing inward from the sides would affect a larger proportion of the formation, and this vulnerability grew even as the Romans felt closer to success. Individual Roman soldiers, especially those in the front ranks, experienced the battle primarily through physical sensations: the push and pull of bodies, the weight of shields, the heat of the sun, and the effort of maintaining footing in the dust. And these sensations occupied their attention fully, leaving little capacity to perceive broader tactical shifts. And even if a soldier sensed that space was becoming tighter or that movement was more constrained, it would have been difficult to attribute these sensations to anything other than the normal press of battle. Hannibal's patience during this phase was as important as any active maneuver, because he allowed Roman momentum to carry them into a position where their own strength became a liability, and this required resisting the temptation to intervene prematurely, to close the trap before the Romans were fully committed. And Hannibal's ability to wait was supported by his confidence in his troops and his understanding of Roman psychology, which told him that the Romans would continue forward as long as progress seemed possible. The gradual loss of awareness within the Roman formation was not the result of ignorance or incompetence, but of the natural limitations of human perception under stress, combined with an organizational structure that prioritized forward movement and cohesion over flexibility. And Hannibal exploited these limitations not by overwhelming the Romans with sudden force, but by guiding their movement in a way that reduced their options without triggering alarm. As the battle progressed through this phase, the Roman army was increasingly enclosed not by visible barriers, but by its own density and momentum, and the space available for movement, decision, and adjustment narrowed steadily, even as the sense of nearing victory persisted. The Carthaginian flanks, now fully oriented inward, were positioned to apply decisive pressure when signalled, and the cavalry, having achieved dominance on the flanks, was preparing to complete the enclosure from the rear, though this development remained largely unseen by the Roman infantry. The Romans, still marching forward in spirit, if not always in space, continued to believe that the solution lay just ahead, that one more push would break the enemy line, and this belief sustained their effort even as conditions became more restrictive. And this is where the phrase momentum without awareness becomes most meaningful, because the Roman army was moving with great force and determination, yet increasingly unaware of how that movement was shaping the battle against them. Hannibal's strategy at Cannae did not rely on deception in the sense of hiding information, but on the careful management of perception, allowing the Romans to see exactly what they expected to see, a retreating centre and a narrowing path to victory, while preventing them from seeing how their own actions were creating the conditions for encirclement. As the Romans pressed deeper, the distance to the Carthaginian camp behind the lines increased, and the possibility of disengagement diminished, because turning such a dense formation around under pressure would have been extremely difficult, and even slowing the advance risked creating confusion and disorder. The battle at this stage was thus characterized by a quiet inevitability, not yet obvious but steadily emerging, as the Romans continued to apply pressure forward, unaware that their momentum had already carried them beyond the point where simple adjustment could restore balance. And as this momentum persisted, guided by habit and confidence rather than situational awareness, the final elements of Hannibal's design moved into place, preparing the way for the next phase of the battle, when containment would become enclosure and the consequences of marching in without full awareness would fully reveal themselves. As the battle at Cannae moved into this next phase, the most noticeable change was not a sudden surge of violence or a dramatic reversal, but the gradual closing of space, a quiet compression that altered how the Roman army could move, breathe, and respond. And this closing of space was the natural consequence of everything that had come before, shaped by Roman momentum and Hannibal's restraint. And, once it began in earnest, it became increasingly difficult to counter. The Roman infantry, now deeply embedded within the curved Carthaginian line, found that the freedom of forward movement they had enjoyed earlier was diminishing, as the narrowing corridor created by the inward-angled flanks reduced lateral room and made it harder to adjust formation, and while forward pressure still existed, it no longer translated into clear progress, because the space ahead was filled with bodies and resistance rather than open ground, and this shift was subtle enough that it did not immediately register as danger, but it did introduce a sense of strain that spread through the ranks. Soldiers began to notice that maintaining formation required more effort, that shields pressed more tightly together, and that moving even a step sideways was difficult without disrupting those around them. And these sensations were often interpreted as the normal intensification of battle rather than as signs of encirclement, because Roman training emphasized endurance under pressure and the ability to fight effectively in close quarters. Communication within the Roman formation became even more constrained. They space closed, with officers finding it harder to move along the line or to relay instructions backward, and as a result, local decisions increasingly replaced coordinated action, with centurions and junior officers responding to immediate pressures rather than broader tactical considerations. And while this decentralized response allowed the Romans to continue fighting effectively in small pockets, it reduced the army's ability to act as a cohesive whole. Hannibal's African infantry on the flanks, now fully oriented inward, began to apply consistent lateral pressure, engaging Roman soldiers from angles that were less familiar and more difficult to counter, and this pressure was applied steadily rather than violently, designed to hold the Romans in place rather than to push them back. And this holding action further reduced available space, creating a sense of containment that grew more pronounced with each passing moment. The Roman cavalry's defeat on the flanks, though decisive, continued to exert its influence quietly, because the absence of Roman horsemen meant that the infantry had no protection or awareness beyond their immediate engagement, and as Hannibal's cavalry regrouped and prepared to move behind the Roman formation, the infantry remained focused forward, unaware that the last avenues of retreat and reinforcement were being closed. The dust, stirred by constant movement and the heat of the day, added to the sense of enclosure, making breathing more laborious and reducing visibility. And these environmental factors, while not overwhelming on their own, compound. Indeed, the effects of crowding and fatigue, making it harder for soldiers to maintain awareness and coordination. And in such conditions, even experienced troops can struggle to perceive the larger pattern of a battle. The Roman formation, originally designed to maximize forward force, now worked against itself, because its depth meant that pressure from behind continued even as forward movement slowed, compressing the front ranks and limiting their ability to maneuver or withdraw. And this compression created a feedback loop where soldiers pushed forward because they were being pushed from behind, not because space existed to move into, and this dynamic increased exhaustion and frustration, though it did not yet produce panic. Hannibal, observing these developments, understood that the battle was entering its decisive stage, but he did not rush to conclude it, because his strategy relied on maintaining control and preventing any sudden release of pressure that might allow the Romans to break free or reorganize. And this control was exercised through coordination rather than force, ensuring that the flanks maintained their inward pressure and that the cavalry timed its movement carefully to seal the enclosure at the right moment. Within the Roman ranks, some soldiers may have begun to sense that something was wrong, noticing that the enemy seemed to be pressing from the sides as well as resisting from the front. But articulating this awareness and translating it into effective action was difficult in the midst of noise, dust, and physical strain, and without clear orders from Ove. Individual concerns were often subsumed by the immediate need to hold one's position and support comrades nearby. The closing of space also affected morale in a subtle way, because while Roman soldiers were trained to fight in close order, The sense of being gradually confined without clear progress could erode confidence over time, replacing the earlier sense of momentum with a feeling of effort without reward. And this shift, though gradual, influenced how soldiers perceived their situation, making them more reactive and less proactive. Hannibal's plan exploited this psychological dimension by allowing the Romans to feel the pressure of containment without triggering a sudden crisis, because sudden shocks can provoke decisive responses, while gradual constraints often lead to hesitation and confusion, and by tightening the space slowly, Hannibal ensured that by the time the Romans fully recognized their predicament, their ability to respond effectively would be severely limited. The African infantry, experienced in close combat, used their shorter swords and disciplined formations to maintain pressure and deny space, and their ability to fight effectively in confined conditions gave them an advantage over Roman soldiers who were accustomed to having more room to maneuver, and this difference in fighting style became increasingly significant as the battle compressed. The Gauls and Iberians in the centre, having completed their controlled retreat, now stabilized their position, contributing to the containment by holding the Romans in place rather than yielding further ground. And this stabilization marked the transition from shaping the battle to securing its outcome, because it removed the illusion of continued progress while maintaining the pressure that prevented withdrawal. The Roman commanders, facing the reality of a stalled advance and growing lateral pressure, may have attempted to issue orders to adjust formation or to disengage, but the physical and organizational constraints of the situation made such orders difficult to implement, because turning or withdrawing a dense formation under pressure requires space and coordination that were no longer available, and even partial success in one area would not have been sufficient to reverse the overall situation. The closing of space thus became the defining feature of this phase of the battle, transforming the Roman army from an advancing force into a contained mass, and this transformation occurred without a clear moment of transition, making it harder to identify and respond to. And as the enclosure tightened, the Romans' options narrowed steadily, leaving them increasingly reliant on endurance rather than maneuver. Hannibal's cavalry, now free from opposition, began its movement toward the rear of the Roman formation, completing the encirclement not through a dramatic charge, but through deliberate positioning that blocked escape and reinforced the sense of containment. And this movement, though decisive, remained largely unseen by the Roman infantry until its effects became unavoidable. The battle at this stage was no longer about breaking lines or achieving breakthroughs, but outmanaging space, fatigue, and morale within an increasingly confined environment. And Hannibal's mastery of these elements allowed him to maintain control without exposing his own forces to unnecessary risk. As the hours passed and the sun climbed higher, the closing of space continued to sap Roman strength, making each movement more difficult and each decision more constrained, and this gradual erosion of flexibility and awareness set the stage for the final phase of the battle, when containment would fully give way to enclosure and the consequences of marching in without room to maneuver would become impossible to ignore. And in this way, the closing of space at Cannae demonstrated how an army can be defeated not by sudden shock, but by the steady removal of options, guided by patience, coordination, and an understanding of how momentum, once committed, can be turned inward against itself. By the time the battle reached this stage, the shift from containment to enclosure was no longer merely a matter of geometry or pressure, but a lived experience for the Roman soldiers within the formation, though even now it unfolded gradually rather than all at once, because at Cannae, decisive moments did not arrive with a single signal or sound, but with the accumulation of small realizations that together altered how the battle was understood. The inward pressure from Hannibal's African infantry on the flanks became more pronounced, not through sudden advances, but through steady engagement that reduced what little lateral space remained, and Roman soldiers on the edges of the formation now faced enemies, not only in front of them, but to their sides as well, forcing them to divide their attention and adjust their stance in ways that disrupted the forward-facing cohesion they had relied upon earlier. This change in orientation, subtle at first, had profound implications, because Roman formations were designed primarily for frontal engagement, and while Roman soldiers were capable fighters, their training emphasized maintaining a forward-facing line and being engaged from multiple directions challenged both their tactics and their mental framework for understanding the fight. The cavalry's role in completing the enclosure now became decisive, as Hannibal's mounted troops, having secured dominance on the flanks, moved behind the Roman infantry, not rushing headlong, but positioning themselves deliberately to block, retreat, and reinforce the sense that movement was no longer possible beyond the immediate confines of the formation, and this movement was not immediately obvious to all Roman soldiers, but its effects were felt as the pressure from behind increased and the option of withdrawal disappeared within the Roman ranks. Communication became increasingly fragmented, with officers finding it difficult to move along the line or to relay instructions through the dense mass of men, and as a result, the army's ability to act as a unified whole diminished further, replaced by localized efforts to hold position and respond to immediate threats. And while this resilience allowed individual groups to continue fighting effectively for a time, it could not compensate for the loss of strategic flexibility that enclosure imposed. The realization that the enemy was now present on multiple sides did not necessarily produce panic, because Roman discipline and training emphasized endurance and mutual support, but it did alter the emotional tone of the battle, replacing earlier confidence with a quieter, more inward-focused determination to survive the moment. And this shift in mindset mattered because it marked the transition from seeking victory to managing crisis, even if that crisis was not yet fully acknowledged. Hannibal's forces, experienced in coordinated maneuver, continued to apply pressure with restraint, ensuring that the enclosure tightened without creating gaps that might allow the Romans to break out, and this restraint required discipline, because the temptation to press harder or to seek individual advantage had to be subordinated to the collective goal of maintaining the encirclement, and Hannibal's command structure, built on trust and experience, allowed his officers to execute this phase with precision. The African infantry, now engaged on the sides of the Roman formation, used their familiarity with close combat to deny space and control movement, while the Iberians and Gauls in the centre stabilized their position, preventing further Roman advance and contributing to the sense of stasis that settled over the battlefield. And this combination of lateral and frontal pressure created an environment where Roman soldiers found themselves fighting in place rather than moving forward, a significant psychological shift. Earlier phases of the battle, the physical sensations of enclosure were unmistakable, as soldiers felt the press of bodies on all sides, the difficulty of raising weapons fully, and the strain of maintaining footing in a confined space. And these sensations, while manageable individually, accumulated over time, increasing fatigue and reducing the effectiveness of coordinated action. And in such conditions, even experienced troops can find their endurance, tested not by fear, but by exhaustion and frustration. Hannibal observed this transition closely, adjusting the timing and intensity of pressure to ensure that the enclosure remained secure, and his ability to maintain oversight during this phase reflected his understanding that the battle's outcome now depended less on dramatic action than on sustaining the conditions that prevented Roman escape, and this understanding allowed him to remain calm and focused even as the significance of the moment became clear. The Roman commanders, facing the reality of enclosure, may have attempted to issue orders to break out or to reorient the formation, but the density of the ranks and the presence of enemy forces on multiple sides made such maneuvers extremely difficult, because any attempt to create space or change direction risked creating disorder that could be exploited immediately and without clear corridors of movement. Even well-intentioned orders could not be implemented effectively. The enclosure also had implications for morale, because while Roman soldiers were trained to fight in close order, the sense that options were narrowing and that the battle was no longer unfolding according to plan could erode confidence over time, replacing it with a focus on immediate survival rather than coordinated effort. And this inward turn of attention further reduced the army's ability to respond collectively. Hannibal's cavalry, positioned behind the Roman formation, reinforced the enclosure by threatening any attempt at withdrawal, and their presence ensured that the Roman infantry could not simply disengage and regroup, transforming the battlefield into a confined space where endurance rather than maneuver defined the struggle, and this transformation was central to Hannibal's strategy, because it neutralized Rome's numerical advantage by preventing those numbers from being brought to bear effectively. As the hours passed, the enclosure tightened incrementally, with each small adjustment by Hannibal's forces reducing Roman options further, and this incremental approach prevented sudden shocks that might have galvanized a coordinated response, instead allowing fatigue, confusion, and frustration to accumulate gradually. The battle at this stage was no longer about advancing or retreating, but about holding ground in an increasingly restricted environment, and this shift in objective, from movement to endurance, marked a decisive change in the character of the fight, one that favoured Hannibal's experienced and coordinated forces. The Romans, now surrounded on most sides, continued to resist with determination, but their resistance occurred within a framework that Hannibal controlled, and this control it's the product of patience, planning, and an understanding of how to guide an enemy into a position where their own strengths could not be used effectively. The moment of enclosure at Cannae, therefore, was not a single instant, but a process, unfolding over time as space closed, awareness narrowed, and options disappeared, and it demonstrated how an army can find itself surrounded not by sudden surprise, but by the gradual consequence of its own movement. And as this process reached completion, the battle entered its final phase, where the outcome was shaped less by new actions than by the conditions already established, and in this way Hannibal's waiting gave way to fulfillment, as the Romans, having marched in with confidence, now found themselves enclosed within a situation from which escape would be exceedingly difficult. As the enclosure at Cannae reached its full expression, the character of the battle shifted once more, moving from a contest of motion and positioning into something quieter, heavier, and more static, where movement itself became difficult and stillness settled over the field, not as peace, but as constraint. And this transition was perhaps the most psychologically significant moment of the entire battle, because it marked the point at which the Roman army, once defined by steady advance, found itself largely unable to move at all. Within the dense mass of Roman infantry, forward progress slowed to a near halt as resistance from the Carthaginian centre stiffened and pressure from the flanks and rear closed in. And this loss of movement was not announced by any signal or command, but felt individually by soldiers who realized that stepping forward no longer created space, that shifting sideways required effort and coordination that was increasingly unavailable, and that turning around was no longer an option. And this realization, emerging gradually rather than suddenly, altered how the battle was experienced at every level. Roman soldiers, trained to fight shoulder to shoulder, now found that even this familiar formation felt different, because the density of the ranks reduced visibility and airflow, making breathing more laborious and amplifying fatigue. And as the heat of the day combined with the exertion of prolonged engagement, the physical strain became a defining feature of the moment, shaping attention and decision-making more powerfully than fear or confusion. The inability to move freely also disrupted the rhythms of combat, because Roman tactics relied on rotation of men, small advances, and coordinated pushes, all of which required space and timing. And without these elements, fighting became more reactive and localized, with individuals responding to immediate pressures rather than executing broader maneuvers. And while Roman discipline allowed them to maintain order longer than many armies might have, the loss of movement nonetheless eroded their effectiveness over time. Hannibal's forces, by contrast, were able to maintain relative freedom of movement within their own formations because they controlled the perimeter of the engagement. And this asymmetry mattered greatly because it allowed Hannibal to regulate the intensity and direction of pressure, tightening or easing it as needed to maintain the enclosure without exhausting his own troops prematurely. The African infantry on the flanks, experienced in close quarters fighting, used their shorter weapons and disciplined formations to deny Roman movement, stepping forward just enough to hold their ground and then pausing, conserving energy while maintaining control. And this measured approach prevented the Romans from finding opportunities to push back or create gaps. The Carthaginian cavalry, positioned behind the Roman formation, completed the transformation of the battlefield into a confined space, not by charging repeatedly, but by remaining present, visible enough to deter withdrawal, and coordinated enough to respond if any attempt was made to break out. And this presence reinforced the sense of stillness, because it removed the possibility of retreat or reorientation. Within the Roman ranks, the realization that movement was no longer possible began to affect morale in a quiet, internal way, not through sudden panic, but through a gradual shift in focus. As soldiers concentrated on holding their immediate position and supporting those nearby, rather than thinking about progress or victory. And this inward focus, while sustaining resistance, also limited the army's ability to act collectively, because coordination requires awareness beyond the immediate surroundings. The loss of movement also affected command and control, as Roman officers found it increasingly difficult to reposition units or to implement changes in formation. And even when orders could be given, the physical constraints of the situation often prevented them from being carried out effectively, because there was simply no space to move into. And this limitation meant that leadership could influence morale, but not geometry. And at Cannae, geometry had become decisive. Hannibal understood this transition well, because his strategy relied on turning motion into stillness, on allowing the Romans to advance until their own density prevented further movement, and then maintaining that density through controlled pressure. And his ability to recognize when this point had been reached allowed him to avoid unnecessary risks, focusing instead on preserving the conditions that favored his army. The stillness that settled over the battlefield was not complete silence, of course, but a relative slowing of large-scale movement, where the clash of arms continued in place rather than advancing or retreating. and this static engagement favoured the side that could manage fatigue, maintain discipline, and control space. And Hannibal's forces, accustomed to prolonged engagements and coordinated action, were better positioned to do so. The Romans, for their part, continued to resist with determination, drawing on their training and sense of duty, but their resistance occurred within a narrowing framework that limited its impact. And as time passed, the accumulation of fatigue, heat, and restricted movement reduced their ability to sustain the same level of effort, even as their resolve remained. The stillness of this phase also had a temporal dimension, because as movement slowed, the battle stretched on, and what might have felt like a brief clash earlier in the day became a prolonged struggle, measured in hours rather than moments. And this extended duration further taxed Roman endurance, because maintaining concentration and physical effort in confined conditions is far more demanding than engaging in short bursts of movement. Hannibal's control of tempo during this phase was as important as his control of space, because by avoiding sudden escalations and allowing the battle to settle into a steady rhythm, he prevented the Romans from finding moments of opportunity or relief, and this steady rhythm favoured the side with greater cohesion and experience in managing long engagements. The psychological effect of stillness should not be underestimated, because soldiers often draw strength from movement, from the sense that effort produces progress, and when that connection is broken, maintaining morale becomes more difficult. And at Cannae, the Romans found themselves expending energy without perceivable gain, a situation that gradually eroded confidence even among seasoned troops. Hannibal's waiting, which had defined the earlier phases of the battle, now manifested as control, as he ensured that the enclosure remained intact and that the Romans remained contained within it. And this control did not require constant intervention, but rather careful monitoring and occasional adjustment, allowing his army to conserve strength while the Romans' options continued to narrow. The transition from movement to stillness thus marked a decisive turning point at Cannae, not because it introduced new actions, but because it solidified the conditions under which the battle would be resolved. And once the Roman army found itself largely unable to move, the outcome was shaped less by tactics and more by endurance, fatigue, and the unyielding geometry of enclosure. And in this way, the battle entered its final, most consequential stage, where the consequences of marching in without room to maneuver became fully apparent, and where waiting, patience, and control proved more powerful than speed or force. As the battle at Cannae settled into this prolonged phase, time itself became one of the most influential forces on the field, because the struggle was no longer defined by rapid movement or decisive maneuvers, but by endurance measured in long, unbroken hours. And it was during this period that the full weight of the situation pressed upon the Roman army, not all at once, but gradually, as the realization grew that the battle would not resolve quickly and that each passing moment made recovery more difficult. The Roman soldiers, confined within a dense formation and surrounded on multiple sides, continued to resist with determination, drawing on their training and sense of duty. But the physical and mental strain of sustained engagement in such conditions began to take its toll, because fighting without the ability to maneuver or rotate positions demands continuous effort from the same individuals, and over time, even the most disciplined troops feel the cumulative effects of fatigue, thirst, and heat. The sun, now higher in the sky, intensified the warmth on the open plain, and while this heat was not unusual for southern Italy, its impact was magnified by the lack of airflow within the crowded ranks, making breathing more laborious and causing sweat to soak clothing and armour. And these physical discomforts, though not overwhelming on their own, compounded over hours, reducing strength and slowing reaction times. Hannibal's forces, positioned around the Roman formation, were able to manage their exertion more effectively because the enclosure allowed them to apply pres, sure in a controlled manner, engaging when needed, and resting in brief intervals when possible. And this ability to regulate effort gave them a significant advantage in a battle defined by duration rather than sudden action. The African infantry on the flanks maintained steady pressure, stepping forward to deny space and then holding position, conserving energy while preventing the Romans from finding relief, and their experience in prolonged engagements allowed them to remain disciplined and focused even as the hours passed. The Gauls and Iberians in the centre, having completed their role in shaping the battle, now held their ground, contributing to the containment without expending unnecessary energy. And this stabilisation allowed Hannibal to preserve his forces while the Romans continued to struggle within a confined space. The cavalry, positioned behind the Roman formation, remained vigilant but largely inactive, because their presence alone was sufficient to deter withdrawal, and this restraint reflected Hannibal's understanding that decisive action at this stage lay not in repeated charges, but in maintaining the enclosure and allowing time to do its work within the Roman ranks. The long hours tested morale in subtle ways, because while soldiers continued to fight, the absence of progress and the inability to change their situation could lead to a sense of futility, and even disciplined armies are affected by the perception that effort is no longer producing results, and this perception can erode cohesion gradually rather than dramatically. Communication within the Roman formation remained limited, with officers struggling to relay orders through the dense mass of men, and, as a result, coordination across the army diminished further, leaving individual units to act largely on their own initiative. And while this autonomy allowed for continued resistance, it also prevented any coordinated attempt to break out or reorganize, because such efforts require clear communication and shared understanding. The noise of the battle, constant but unchanging, contributed to a sense of monotony that contrasted with the earlier intensity of movement, and this monotony, combined with physical exhaustion, made it harder for soldiers to maintain focus and alertness, increasing the likelihood of mistakes and reducing the effectiveness of collective action. Hannibal, observing the field, understood that patience remained his greatest ally, and he resisted the temptation to accelerate the conclusion of the battle, because doing so might expose his troops to unnecessary risk or create openings for the Romans, and instead he allowed the pressure to remain steady, trusting that the conditions he had established would continue to favour his army as time passed. The Roman commanders, aware that the battle was not unfolding as planned, faced the difficult reality that options were limited, because any attempt to force a breakout would require space, coordination, and momentum that were no longer available, and even partial success in one area would not have been sufficient to relieve pressure across the formation. And this recognition, whether fully articulated or not, shaped their responses during these long hours, focusing efforts on maintaining order and preventing collapse rather than pursuing decisive action. The psychological impact of prolonged enclosure should not be underestimated, because humans are not well suited to sustained high-stress situations without variation or relief, and at Cannae, the Romans experienced a battle that offered little change in rhythm, no clear turning points, and no obvious opportunities for resolution, and this unchanging nature of the struggle made it harder to sustain morale over time. Hannibal's forces, by contrast, benefited from a sense of control and anticipation, because they understood that time favoured them. and this understanding allowed them to remain calm and disciplined, conserving energy and maintaining cohesion even as the battle continued. As the hours wore on, the cumulative effects of fatigue, thirst, and restricted movement reduced the Romans' ability to maintain formation and respond effectively to pressure, and while their resistance remained determined, its intensity and coordination gradually declined, making it easier for Hannibal's forces to maintain the enclosure without increasing their own exertion. The long hours at Cannae thus transformed the battle into a contest of endurance rather than maneuver, and in this contest the conditions established earlier proved decisive, because an army designed to advance and apply pressure found itself trapped in a situation that demanded patience and flexibility, while an army accustomed to waiting and coordinating across dive. RSE units found that time itself worked in its favour. The passage of time also reinforced the sense of inevitability that began to settle over the battlefield, not as a dramatic realization, but as a quiet understanding that the situation was unlikely to change without extraordinary effort. And this understanding influenced how soldiers perceived their role, shifting focus from achieving victory to enduring the present moment. As the sun continued its slow arc across the sky, casting changing shadows over the crowded plain, the battle at Cannae remained locked in this prolonged phase, where movement was limited, options were scarce, and the outcome was increasingly shaped by the steady accumulation of small disadvantages rather than by any single decisive blow. And in this way, the long hours underscored the effectiveness of Hannibal's strategy, which relied not on sudden brilliance, but on the patient creation of conditions that allowed time to become an ally, quietly but inexorably determining the course of events. When the struggle at Cannae finally drew to its close, it did not end with a single, clear moment that everyone recognized at once, but rather with a gradual easing of pressure, a slow recognition that resistance had diminished, and that the long hours of containment had achieved their purpose. And this ending, like much of the battle itself, unfolded quietly, shaped by exhaustion, realization, and the simple fact that the conditions of the field no longer allowed the Roman army to act as a unified force. Hannibal's troops, disciplined and experienced, did not rush forward in disorderly pursuit, because their objective had never been chaos but control, and once it became clear that the enclosure had held and that organized resistance was no longer possible across much of the Roman formation, the Carthaginian forces shifted their focus towards securing the field and maintaining cohesion, ensuring that the outcome they had patiently shaped would not be undone by haste or confusion. The Roman soldiers who remained standing found themselves isolated in small groups rather than as part of a coherent army, their sense of collective movement replaced by individual effort, and while many continued to resist out of duty and instinct, the absence of coordination made it clear that the battle, as an organized contest between armies, had effectively ended. Hannibal's leadership during this period reflected the same restraint that had characterized his approach throughout the day, because he understood that victory at this scale carried its own risks, and that preserving his army's cohesion and readiness was more important than extracting every possible advantage from the moment. And this understanding guided how his troops were instructed to proceed, emphasizing order over aggression. The physical environment of the battlefield, shaped by hours of movement and struggle, now bore the marks of prolonged engagement, with the dust that had risen earlier settling slowly, the heat lingering in the air, and the open plain returning to a kind of stillness that contrasted sharply with the intensity of the preceding hours. And this stillness allowed both sides to recognize, in their own ways, that the battle had reached its conclusion. Hannibal's soldiers, many of whom had fought alongside one another for years, moved deliberately among the field, checking on comrades, gathering equipment, and reforming their units. And this reorganization was not merely practical, but symbolic, reaffirming the cohesion that had made their victory possible, and their calm demeanor reflected an understanding that the outcome had been achieved through patience rather than frenzy. For the Romans, the aftermath was defined by disorientation and loss of structure, because the army that had marched into battle as a single massive force no longer existed in that form, and those who survived found themselves separated from familiar units, uncertain of orders, and confronted with the reality that the expectations they had carried into the battle no longer applied. The scale of Rome's loss, while not immediately quantified on the field, became apparent through the absence of voices, banners, and formations that had once filled the plain. And this absence carried a weight that was felt even before numbers were counted or reports sent, because the emptiness where an army had stood spoke more clearly than any message. Hannibal, having secured the field, did not pursue a direct march on Rome, a decision that has often been debated, but that made sense within the context of his broader strategy, because his objective had never been to destroy Rome in a single gesture, but to weaken its capacity and confidence over time, and the victory at Cannae, decisive as it was, served that purpose by demonstrating that Rome's traditional approach to warfare could be turned against it under the right conditions. The restraint shown after the battle also reflected the practical realities of Hannibal's position, because his army, though victorious, remained far from home and dependent on careful management of resources and alliances, and preserving its strength was essential for continuing the campaign in Italy, and this pragmatic awareness guided Hannibal's actions as much as his strategic insight. The aftermath of Cannae thus became a moment of transition rather than finality, because while the battle itself had ended, its consequences were only beginning to unfold, shaping decisions, perceptions, and strategies on both sides. And the quiet on the battlefield marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. For Rome, the immediate impact of the battle would soon be felt in the city itself, as news travelled back and the reality of the defeat became clear, and this reality challenged Rome's sense of invincibility without breaking its resolve, forcing a re-evaluation of tactics and leadership that would shape the remainder of the war. For Hannibal, the victory confirmed the effectiveness of patience, observation, and restraint, reinforcing his belief that understanding an enemy's habits could be more powerful than confronting their strength directly, and this belief would continue to guide his actions as the campaign progressed. The battlefield at Cannae, once crowded with movement and noise, now stood as a quiet testament to the tup's sea lessons, its open plain offering no obvious sign of the drama that had unfolded there. And this contrast between appearance and history underscored one of the enduring truths of warfare, that the most significant outcomes often arise not from spectacle, but from the careful shaping of conditions over time, as the dust settled and the day drew toward evening. The battle receded into memory for those who had witnessed it, but its impact endured, carried forward in decisions, stories, and strategic thought, and the aftermath of Cannae thus became not merely the conclusion of a single engagement, but a turning point that reshaped how Rome and its enemies understood the nature of power, confidence, and restraint. And in this way, the end of the battle was not an ending at all, but the beginning of a longer process of reflection and adaptation, one that would echo far beyond the quiet plain where Rome had marched in and Hannibal had waited. When news of the defeat at Cannae reached Rome, it did not arrive all at once or in a single, clear account, but filtered in through fragments, messengers, and the absence of expected reports. And this gradual realization shaped Rome's response in a way that reflected both shock and restraint. Because Rome was a society accustomed to absorbing hardship without surrendering to it, and even in moments of profound loss, it tended to respond not with collapse, but with recalibration. The immediate reaction within the city was marked by quiet disbelief rather than panic. As families waited for names, senators gathered to assess the situation, and officials sought to understand not only what had happened, but what it meant for the future of the war. And this process unfolded deliberately because Rome's political culture emphasized continuity and order, even in crisis. And this emphasis helped prevent the kind of sudden upheaval that might have followed such a defeat in a less structured society. Public mourning was regulated, not to diminish the gravity of the loss, but to prevent despair from overwhelming civic life. And this regulation reflected Rome's belief that emotional discipline was as important as military discipline, especially in moments when confidence had been shaken. The Senate moved quickly to reassert authority and direction, issuing instructions, coordinating defense, and reassuring allies that Rome remained committed to the war. And these actions were not merely symbolic, but practical steps designed to maintain cohesion across a vast network of communities that depended on Rome's leadership. One of the most significant aspects of Rome's response was its refusal to negotiate with Hannibal, even in the face of such a devastating defeat, because to do so would have contradicted Rome's deeply held belief that wars were resolved through endurance rather than accommodation, and this refusal sent a clear message, both internally and externally, that Rome would continue to resist regardless of the cost. This stance was not driven by denial of reality, but by a calculated understanding that Rome's strength lay in its ability to absorb losses and continue mobilizing resources. And while Cannae represented a set, severe blow, it did not eliminate Rome's capacity to raise new armies or defend its territory. Practical measures followed swiftly as Rome began recruiting new legions, drawing on younger and older age groups, and even extending service obligations in ways that reflected the urgency of the situation. And these measures, though demanding, were accepted as necessary because Roman society was structured around the expectation that citizens would contribute to the defense of the state in times of need. At the same time, Rome adjusted its strategic approach, becoming more cautious in its engagements with Hannibal, avoiding large-scale confrontations, and instead focusing on containment, harassment, and the gradual wearing down of the Carthaginian forces. And this shift marked an important evolution in Roman military thinking, because it demonstrated a willingness to adapt rather than persist blindly in methods that had proven vulnerable. The appointment of commanders who favoured caution and incremental progress over decisive battles reflected this change. And while such commanders were sometimes criticised for lacking boldness, their approach aligned with the lessons Rome had learned at great cost, and this alignment helped restore a sense of control and direction. Rome also took steps to secure its alliances, reassuring communities across Italy that it remained capable of protecting them. And while some allies did defect in the wake of Cannae, the majority remained loyal, a testament to the depth of Rome's political and social integration within the region. And this loyalty provided a foundation for continued resistance. Within the city, daily life continued with adjustments, as citizens balanced mourning with responsibility, and this balance reflected Rome's capacity to integrate loss into its collective identity without allowing it to define the future. And this capacity was reinforced through rituals, public speeches, and the visible presence of authority figures who emphasized resilience and continuity. The memory of Cannae became a point of reflection rather than paralysis. serving as a reminder of vulnerability, but also as a catalyst for change. And Roman leaders began to analyze the battle not simply as a failure, but as a lesson in the dangers of overconfidence and the importance of understanding an enemy's strategy, and this analytical approach laid the groundwork for reforms and adjustments that would shape subsequent campaigns. Rome's response also included measures to strengthen internal security and preparedness, ensuring that the city itself was defended and that no opportunity was given for panic or disorder to undermine morale. And these measures contributed to a sense of stability that helped the population absorb the shock of defeat without losing faith in the state. Over time, the initial shock of Cannae gave way to a more measured determination. As Rome committed itself to a long war of attrition rather than a quest for immediate vindication, and this commitment reflected a recognition that Hannibal's strength lay in his ability to exploit Rome's desire for decisive battles, and that denying him such opportunities was essential, led to regaining the initiative. The Senate's ability to maintain unity during this period was crucial, because political fragmentation could have compounded military defeat, and while debates and disagreements certainly occurred, the overarching goal of preserving the Republic provided a common purpose that transcended individual ambitions. Rome's response to Cannae thus revealed a complex interplay between tradition and adaptation, because while the Republic held fast to its core values of endurance, discipline, and collective responsibility, it also demonstrated a capacity to adjust tactics and expectations in light of experience, and this balance would prove decisive in the long run. The defeat at Cannae did not mark the end of Rome's power, but rather a moment of transformation, forcing the Republic to confront its limitations and to refine its approach to warfare and leadership. And in doing so, it set the stage for the eventual recovery that would follow, even if that recovery lay years in the future. The quiet determination that characterized Rome's response contrasted sharply with the dramatic nature of the defeat itself. And this contrast underscored one of Rome's defining qualities: its ability to endure without spectacle, to absorb loss without surrender, and to continue forward even when confidence had been deeply shaken. And in this way, Rome's response to Cannae became as significant as the battle itself, shaping the course of the war not through immediate action, but through sustained resolve, adaptation, and a renewed understanding of the cost and complexity of confronting an enemy who had demonstrated that patience and insight could be as powerful as numbers and strength. Hannibal's decision to wait at Cannae, rather than to rush toward immediate confrontation or seek quick resolution, was not a momentary impulse, but the expression of a philosophy shaped by experience, observation, and a deep understanding of how armies and societies behave under pressure. And this philosophy explains not only what happened on the battlefield, but why it unfolded in the particular way that it did. Because waiting for Hannibal was not inaction, but a form of control exercised through restraint. From his earliest campaigns, Hannibal had learned that the greatest advantage often lay not in striking first, but in allowing an opponent to reveal their intentions fully, and this lesson was reinforced repeatedly as he faced Roman armies that relied on confidence, structure, and momentum, because by observing how Rome advanced, reacted, and committed, Hannibal could anticipate its decisions and shape the conditions under which those decisions were made. Waiting allowed Hannibal to gather information without provoking unnecessary resistance, to test Roman responses without forcing a decisive clash before the moment was right. And this deliberate pacing contrasted sharply with Rome's preference for clear, direct action, creating a strategic asymmetry that Hannibal exploited with patience rather than force. At Cannae, waiting served several interconnected purposes, beginning with the psychological, because by allowing Rome to march forward unopposed at first, Hannibal reinforced Roman confidence and reduced the likelihood that Roman commanders would question their assumptions. And this reinforcement was crucial because doubt can interrupt momentum, and Hannibal's plan depended on Rome committing fully to an advance that felt both logical and successful. Waiting also allowed Hannibal to manage the physical dimensions of the battlefield, guiding Roman movement into a shape that favored encirclement. And this guidance required time, because space must be shaped gradually if it is to be perceived as opportunity rather than constraint. And by waiting, Hannibal allowed the Romans to create the very conditions that would later limit their options. The choice to wait reflected Hannibal's trust in his troops, because only an army confident in its discipline and cohesion can afford to delay action in the face of a larger force. And Hannibal's experience with his soldiers, forged through years of campaigning, allowed him to rely on their ability to execute complex maneuvers under pressure without losing morale or cohesion. This trust was reciprocal because Hannibal's soldiers had learned through repeated experience that his patience was purposeful, that waiting did not mean vulnerability but preparation, and this shared understanding enabled the army to maintain calm and focus even as the Roman forces loomed larger across the plain. Waiting also conserved Hannibal's resources, because rushing into battle against a numerically superior enemy would have risked unnecessary losses and reduced the effectiveness of his strategy. And by delaying decisive engagement until the conditions were favourable, Hannibal ensured that his troops could fight on tear, means that maximised their strengths while minimising their weaknesses. The cultural contrast between Hannibal's approach and Rome's expectations played a significant role here, because Roman commanders and soldiers were conditioned to interpret waiting as weakness or indecision, and Hannibal understood this perception well, using it to his advantage by presenting a posture that invited advance rather than caution. This understanding extended beyond the battlefield, because Hannibal recognized that Rome's political and social systems rewarded visible action and decisive confrontation, and that prolonged uncertainty created pressure for resolution. And by waiting, Hannibal allowed this pressure to build, shaping Roman decisions long before the battle began. The decision to wait also reflected Hannibal's appreciation of time as a strategic resource, because time can erode morale, amplify fatigue, and expose weaknesses in organization. And at Cannae, time worked in Hannibal's favor by allowing Roman momentum to transform into overcommitment, while his own forces remained flexible and responsive. Waiting required confidence, not only in one's plan, but in one's judgment, because it demands resisting the impulse to act simply because action is expected, and Hannibal's ability to resist this impulse set him apart from many commanders of his era who might have sought immediate engagement to prove strength or seize initiative, and this restraint demonstrated a maturity of leadership grounded in long-term thinking rather than short-term gain. The effectiveness of waiting at Cannae also depended on Hannibal's ability to coordinate multiple elements of his army, because timing was essential, and waiting allowed him to synchronize the movements of infantry and cavalry, ensuring that each played its role at the right moment, and without this synchronization, the encirclement could not have succeeded. Hannibal's waiting was thus not passive, but dynamic, involving constant observation, adjustment, and communication as he monitored Roman movement, assessed the readiness of his own troops, and judged when the balance between opportunity and risk had reached its optimal point. This dynamic waiting required emotional control, because the presence of a larger enemy can provoke anxiety or impatience, and Hannibal's calm demeanor helped maintain discipline and focus among his commanders and soldiers. reinforcing the belief that the plan would unfold as intended. The outcome at Cannae validated this approach, demonstrating that patience, when guided by insight and preparation, can achieve results that brute force alone cannot. And this validation resonated beyond the immediate battle, influencing how later generations would interpret Hannibal's legacy and the nature of strategic mastery. Waiting also shaped the moral dimension of Hannibal's leadership, because it reflected a respect for his soldiers' lives, seeking to achieve victory with minimal unnecessary sacrifice. And while war inevitably involves hardship, the choice to wait rather than rush demonstrated a commitment to efficiency and purpose rather than spectacle. In the broader context of the Second Punic War, Hannibal's waiting at Cannae exemplified his approach to confronting Rome as a system rather than as a single army, because he understood that defeating Rome required disrupting its habits, expectations, and confidence over time, and waiting was a tool that allowed him to do so by letting Rome reveal and reinforce its own patterns. The lesson of why Hannibal waited thus extends beyond the specifics of Cannae, offering insight into the power of restraint in leadership and the strategic value of allowing an opponent's strengths to become liabilities. And this lesson remains relevant precisely because it challenges the assumption that success comes from speed or aggression alone. At Cannae, Hannibal's waiting transformed the battlefield into a space where Roman momentum could be redirected inward. And this transformation required patience, trust, and a willingness to let events unfold gradually. And in doing so, Hannibal demonstrated that waiting, when informed by understanding and executed with discipline, can be one of the most decisive actions a commander can take, shaping outcomes quietly but profoundly, and leaving a legacy that continues to invite reflection on the nature of power, timing, and control long after the dust of the battlefield has settled. Rome marched into Cannae not because it misunderstood danger, but because it understood itself, and this distinction is important because Rome's decision to advance was rooted in deeply ingrained habits, cultural expectations, and institutional confidence that had been reinforced over generations. And these forces combine to make forward movement feel not only reasonable, but necessary, even when caution might have offered an alternative. Roman military culture was built on the belief that discipline, cohesion, and perseverance could overcome any obstacle if applied consistently, and this belief had been validated repeatedly through centuries of conflict, shaping a collective mindset in which hesitation was often equated with weakness and decisive action with strength. And in this context, marching forward was not seen as a gamble, but as the most reliable path to resolution. The structure of the Roman army itself reinforced this inclination, because its formations, command hierarchy, and training emphasized steady advance, close order, and sustained pressure. And Roman soldiers were conditioned to trust that by maintaining formation and momentum, they could impose their will on the battlefield. And this conditioning made forward movement feel instinctive, especially when early signs suggested that the enemy was yielding ground. Political pressures also played a significant role in Rome's decision to march in, because Roman leaders were accountable not only to strategic realities, but to public expectation. And in a society where military success was closely tied to political legitimacy and honor, prolonged indecision could be damaging. And the presence of Hannibal in Italy, undefeated and active, created a sense that the war required a decisive demonstration of Roman strength to reassure allies and citizens alike. The decision to assemble an exceptionally large army reflected this desire for clarity and resolution, because numbers offered a tangible expression of power that could be seen, counted and trusted, and when such a force was gathered, the expectation naturally followed that it would be used assertively rather than held back. Rome's experience in earlier battles also shaped its expectations at Cannae, because even when Roman armies had suffered setbacks, they often recovered through persistence, returning with renewed strength and eventually prevailing. And this historical pattern reinforced the belief that temporary difficulties could be overcome by applying greater force in a direct manner, and that an enemy who relied on maneuver and delay would eventually be worn down by sustained pressure. The presence of dual consuls, a feature of Roman command designed to balance authority, also influenced the decision to march in, because shared leadership can create momentum toward action when both commanders operate within the same cultural framework that values decisiveness. And while disagreements may have existed over tactics or timing, the overarching expectation that Rome should confront Hannibal directly remained largely uncontested. The terrain at Cannae further reinforced Rome's inclination to advance, because the open plain appeared to favour Roman infantry tactics, offering space to deploy, visibility to assess the enemy, and familiarity that reduced the perceived need for caution. And when environment and expectation align, the impulse to move forward becomes stronger, as the situation seems to confirm one's assumptions rather than challenge those. Rome's allies and subject communities also exerted subtle pressure, because their loyalty was tied to confidence in Rome's ability to protect and lead, and a decisive victory over Hannibal would reaffirm Rome's authority and discourage defection, while continued maneuvering without resolution risked undermining that confidence. And this broader strategic context made forward action appear not only militarily desirable, but politically necessary. The Roman conception of courage further shaped the decision to march in, because courage was often defined as steadfastness under pressure and willingness to confront danger directly. And these values were celebrated in stories, rituals, and honours that reinforced the idea that retreat or delay, even when strategically sound, could be interpreted as moral failure, and this moral framework made it difficult to embrace strategies that emphasized avoidance or prolonged caution. Rome's confidence in its numbers was not mere arrogance, but a rational assessment based on experience, because massed infantry had served Rome well in many previous conflicts, and the ability to field and sustain large armies was one of Rome's greatest strengths, and relying on this strength at Cannae felt consistent with established practice rather than reckless deviation. The early stages of the battle seemed to validate Rome's decision, because Hannibal's centre retreated under pressure, confirming the expectation that sustained advance would produce results. And this confirmation reinforced momentum, making it even harder to question the underlying assumption. Tians guiding the advance. The psychological dynamics of large formations also played a role, because when thousands of soldiers move together, individual doubts are often subsumed by collective motion, and the physical sensation of being pushed forward by comrades behind can override abstract concerns, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of movement that feels purposeful and controlled even as conditions change. Roman command structures, designed to function effectively in forward-moving engagements, were less suited to rapid reversal or lateral adjustment once momentum was established, and this structural characteristic made it easier to continue advancing than to pause and reassess, especially in the absence of clear signs of crisis. Rome's decision to march in was thus the product of confidence shaped by history, culture, and institutional design, rather than a simple miscalculation, and understanding this helps explain why the Roman army continued to press forward even as the situation became more constrained, because from Rome's perspective, persistence was not stubbornness, but a proven path to victory. Hannibal's strategy exploited these tendencies by presenting a situation that aligned with Roman expectations, while subtly reshaping the battlefield in ways that undermined those expectations. And Rome's march into Cannae was the final expression of a long-standing belief in the power of direct engagement, a belief that had served Rome well in the past, but that proved vulnerable when confronted by an opponent who understood how to guide momentum rather than resist it. Tragedy of Cannae, from Rome's perspective, lay not in ignorance or incompetence, but in the limits of a system that had not yet learned how to adapt its strengths to an enemy who approached war with a different philosophy, and this realization would shape Rome's future responses as the war continued. Marching in, therefore, was not a mistake in isolation, but the culmination of values and habits that defined Roman identity. And while those habits were challenged at Cannae, they were not abandoned, but gradually refined in the years that followed, as Rome learned to balance its instinct for decisive action with a greater appreciation for patience and adaptability. The story of why Rome marched in thus offers insight into the complex interplay between culture, confidence, and decision-making in war, reminding us that choices on the battlefield are rarely the result of a single error, but rather the expression of deeply rooted beliefs about how power should be applied. And at Cannae, those beliefs carried Rome forward with conviction, even as they guided it into a situation where conviction alone could not secure victory. The legacy of Cannae did not emerge immediately after the battle ended, nor was it confined to the field where Rome had marched in and Hannibal had waited, but unfolded slowly over years, generations, and even centuries, as soldiers, statesmen, and thinkers returned to the events of that day to understand not only what had happened, but why it mattered. And this gradual unfolding of meaning is what transformed Cannae from a single engagement into a lasting point of reference for how power, patience, and perception interact in war. For Rome, the immediate lesson of Cannae was not despair but humility, because the defeat forced the Republic to confront the reality that its traditional methods, however successful in the past, were not universally applicable, and that an opponent who understood Roman habits could turn those habits into vulnerabilities, and this realization did not weaken Rome in the long term, but prompted a re-evaluation of how and when to apply its strengths. The most visible expression of this re-evaluation was Rome's adoption of more cautious strategies in subsequent years, avoiding large-scale confrontations with Hannibal, and instead focusing on containment, attrition, and the gradual erosion of Carthaginian influence, an approach that later generations would associate with commanders who understood that denying an enemy decisive opportunities could be as powerful as winning battles outright. Beyond immediate strategy, Cannae reshaped Roman military thinking at a deeper level, influencing how future commanders thought about formation, flexibility, and the dangers of overcommitment. And while Rome would continue to value discipline and cohesion, it also learned to place greater emphasis on adaptability and situational awareness, recognizing that even the most formidable force must remain capable of adjustment. Hannibal's victory at Cannae also left a profound impression beyond Rome, because it demonstrated to allies, rivals, and observers across the Mediterranean that Rome was not invincible. And this percepti had tangible consequences, encouraging some communities to reconsider their allegiance and forcing Rome to work harder to maintain its network of alliances. And while this shift did not ultimately reverse Rome's fortunes, it introduced a level of uncertainty that shaped the broader course of the war. In the realm of military thought, Cannae became a case study in the power of encirclement, patience, and the manipulation of momentum. and long after the dust of the battlefield had settled, commanders and theorists would return to Hannibal's maneuvers to illustrate how an enemy's strength could be redirected inward rather than confronted directly. And this intellectual legacy extended far beyond the ancient world, influencing discussions of strategy in eras that differed vastly in technology, but shared fundamental human dynamics. The enduring fascination with Cannae also reflects its clarity as an example, because the battle's outcome can be traced not to chance or overwhelming force, but to a coherent plan executed with discipline and restraint. And this coherence makes it especially appealing to those seeking to understand the principles underlying successful strategy, rather than merely recounting events. For Hannibal, the legacy of Cannae was complex, because while it represented the height of his tactical achievement, it did not bring the war to an immediate conclusion, and this tension between tactical brilliance and strategic limitation has fueled debate ever since, prompting questions about what victory means and how it should be measured, and these questions have Cannae relevant not as a settled story, but as an ongoing conversation. The battle also contributed to a broader understanding of how culture shapes military behaviour, because Rome's response to Cannae demonstrated that even devastating defeat does not necessarily lead to collapse if a society possesses the capacity to adapt and endure. And this resilience became a defining feature of Roman identity, shaping how Rome would confront future challenges. Cannae's legacy thus encompasses both the demonstration of Hannibal's genius and the revelation of Rome's capacity for recovery, and this duality is part of what gives the battle its lasting significance, because it illustrates that decisive moments can produce divergent outcomes depending on how they are absorbed and interpreted by those involved. The lessons of Cannae were not confined to military contexts, because the battle also offered insight into leadership, patience, and the management of expectations, showing how waiting, observation, and restraint can create opportunities that force alone cannot. And these lessons have been applied metaphorically in fields far removed from the battlefield, where timing and perception play critical roles. The symbolic power of Cannae grew over time as well, becoming a reference point for both caution and aspiration, a reminder of what can be achieved through careful planning and coordination, and a warning of the risks inherent in overconfidence and rigidity. And this symbolic dimension ensured that Cannae remained present in cultural memory long after the details of the battle fad ed from popular awareness. For Rome, the memory of Cannae served as a guidepost rather than a scar, informing future decisions without paralyzing action. And this ability to integrate defeat into a narrative of growth and resilience contributed to Rome's eventual dominance, demonstrating that the legacy of a battle is shaped not only by what happens on the field, but by how its lessons are carried forward. The legacy of Cannae also underscores the importance of perspective, because while the battle is often remembered as a moment of Roman disaster or Carthaginian triumph, its deeper significance lies in the interplay between these perspectives, revealing how success and failure are rarely absolute, and how the same event can generate both caution and confidence depending on how it is interpreted. As centuries passed and the specifics of Cannae were studied, retold, and reimagined, the battle's legacy continued to evolve, reflecting the concerns and values of each new generation that encountered it. And this adaptability of meaning is itself a testament to the battle's enduring relevance. In this way, Cannae became more than a historical episode, transforming into a lens through which questions of power, patience, and human behavior could be examined, and its lessons remained compelling precisely because they were grounded in fundamental aspects of decision-making that transcend time and context. The legacy of Cannae, therefore, is not confined to a single outcome or lesson, but exists as a layered understanding of how battles are shaped by culture, leadership, and the management of momentum, and as long as humans continue to organize, compete, and seek advantage, the quiet wisdom embedded in Hannibal's waiting and Rome's marching will continue to invite reflection, reminding us that the most influential moments in history often unfold slowly, guided by choices made long before their consequences become visible. The story of Cannae endures not simply because of the scale of Rome's defeat or the elegance of Hannibal's tactics, but because it offers a quiet, enduring lesson about the nature of power itself, a lesson that unfolds slowly the more one reflects upon it. And this lesson begins with the realization that power is not always expressed through size, speed, or force, but often through understanding, timing, and the ability to shape another's choices without direct confrontation. At Cannae, Rome possessed overwhelming material strength, numerical superiority, and a deeply ingrained confidence in its institutions. And yet these very attributes became sources of vulnerability when they were applied without sufficient awareness of context, because power, when assumed to be self-sustaining, can encourage patterns of behavior that are predictable and therefore exploitable. Hannibal's approach to power was fundamentally different, because rather than seeking to match Rome's strength directly, he focused on influencing how that strength would be used, guiding Roman momentum into a shape that limited its effectiveness. And this distinction highlights a core insight of Cannae, that power is often less about what one possesses and more about how one's opponent is allowed to act. The Roman army's power lay in its ability to advance, to apply pressure, and to sustain effort over time. And Hannibal did not attempt to deny these abilities outright, but instead allowed them to operate fully, knowing that in doing so, he could shape the conditions under which they became liabilities, rather flaw, and assets. This approach required confidence, not in immediate outcomes, but in process, because Hannibal trusted that if the conditions were shaped correctly, the result would follow naturally. And this trust in process over impulse is one of the most enduring lessons of Cannae. Power, as demonstrated on that field, also involves restraint, because the capacity to act does not always imply the necessity to do so, and Hannibal's willingness to wait, to absorb pressure, and to resist the temptation of early engagement illustrates how restraint can preserve options while encouraging an opponent to narrow theirs. And this dynamic is central to understanding why Rome's strength ultimately worked against it. The Roman experience at Cannae also teaches that power can obscure perception, because confidence in one's capabilities can reduce sensitivity to subtle changes in environment or opposition, and when power is exercised habitually, it can become automatic rather than reflective, leading to decisions driven by expectation rather than observation. And this was evident in Rome's continued advance even as the shape of the battle changed around it. Another lesson lies in the relationship between power and structure. Because Rome's strength was organized within a system designed for direct engagement and sustained advance, and while this structure was highly effective under many circumstances, it lacked flexibility once fully committed, and Hannibal's strategy exploited this rigidity by drawing Rome into a situation where its structure limited its ability to adapt, reminding us that systems of power must balance efficiency with adaptability if they are to remain resilient. Cannae also illustrates that power is relational rather than absolute, because Rome's numerical superiority only mattered in relation to the space, time, and movement available on the battlefield. And once those dimensions were constrained, the advantage of numbers diminished, demonstrating that power cannot be evaluated in isolation from context. Hannibal's victory underscores the importance of understanding how power is perceived, because he relied not on deception in the sense of hiding information, but on aligning Roman perception with Roman expectation, allowing Rome to see exactly what it believed should be happening. And this alignment prevented Rome from questioning its assumptions until it was too late, revealing how perception can be as influential as reality in shaping outcomes. The battle also teaches that power can be undermined by overcommitment, because when an army, organization, or system commits too deeply to a single course of action, it reduces its ability to respond to change. And at Cannae, Rome's commitment to forward momentum became irreversible once certain thresholds were crossed, illustrating the danger of assuming that success lies just beyond the next effort. Endurance, often seen as a form of power, also takes on a more nuanced meaning at Cannae, because while Roman endurance allowed the army to fight on for hours under extreme conditions, it could not compensate for the loss of space and flexibility, showing that endurance alone is insufficient without strategic positioning. Hannibal's power, by contrast, lay in his ability to conserve strength while directing pressure efficiently, and this efficiency allowed his smaller force to outlast and outmaneuver a larger one, reinforcing the idea that sustainable power depends on balance rather than excess. The moral dimension of power also emerges in reflection on Cannae, because Hannibal's strategy sought to achieve decisive results with minimal, unnecessary expenditure of his soldiers' lives. And while the battle was undoubtedly costly, the emphasis on control rather than spectacle suggests a form of leadership that values outcomes over appearances, and this ethical restraint adds another layer to the lesson of power. Rome's eventual recovery from Cannae further complicates the lesson, because it demonstrates that power is not static, and that a single defeat, however severe, does not define the future. If a society possesses the capacity to learn and adapt, and this adaptability becomes a form of power in its own right, one that operates over longer timescales. The legacy of Cannae thus teaches that power must be understood dynamically, as something that shifts with context, perception, and time, and that the most effective use of power often involves guiding events subtly rather than forcing them directly. In broader terms, Cannae invites reflection on how individuals, organizations, and states wield influence, reminding us that the most decisive advantages are often created long before a moment of confrontation, through habits, expectations, and choices that shape what feels possible when pressure arrives. The lesson of power at Cannae is therefore not a prescription for dominance, but a meditation on awareness, restraint, and the management of momentum, suggesting that true power lies in the ability to see beyond immediate strength and to shape the environment in which strength is applied. As long as humans continue to grapple with questions of control, influence, and decision-making under pressure, the quiet wisdom of Cannae will remain relevant, offering a reminder that power, when exercised thoughtfully and patiently, can achieve outcomes that force alone cannot, and that understanding the limits of one's own strength may be the first step toward using it wisely. As the story of Cannae draws toward its close, it becomes clear that the battle was not defined by a single decision, a single maneuver, or a single mistake, but by a long chain of choices and assumptions that unfolded gradually, each one shaping the conditions for the next. And this gradual unfolding is what gives Cannae its quiet power as a historical moment, because it reminds us that outcomes often become inevitable long before they are recognized as such. Rome's march into Cannae felt purposeful, logical, and justified at every step, guided by traditions that had brought success again and again. And Hannibal's waiting, though less visible, was equally purposeful, shaped by observation, restraint, and an understanding of how momentum can narrow options rather than expand them. The inevitability of Cannae did not arise from fate or chance, but from alignment. The alignment of Roman confidence with Hannibal's patience, of open terrain with forward momentum, and of institutional habit with individual expectation. And once these elements aligned, the battle followed a path that was difficult to alter without a fundamental shift in perception or behavior. One of the most striking aspects of Cannae is how little drama accompanied its most decisive moments, because the trap closed not with a sudden signal, but with the steady disappearance of alternatives. And this quiet closing invites reflection on how often decisive changes in life, leadership, and history occur without fanfare, becoming clear only in retrospect. The Roman soldiers at Cannae did not march forward expecting disaster, nor did Hannibal's troops wait with certainty of triumph, but both acted within frameworks that felt reasonable and justified. And this shared sense of normalcy underscores how inevitability often feels indistinguishable from routine until it is complete. Hannibal's genius lay not in predicting the future with certainty, but in understanding patterns of behavior well enough to guide them. And this guidance did not require control over every variable, but confidence that human habits, once engaged, tend to persist. And Rome's strength lay in its willingness to act decisively. But at Cannae, decisiveness without adaptability proved limiting, illustrating how strengths and weaknesses often exist as two sides of the same trait. Reflecting calmly on Cannae allows us to see the battle not as a story of cleverness defeating brute force, but as a meditation on timing, perception, and the accumulation of small decisions, each one seemingly minor, yet together forming a path that led to a profound outcome. The inevitability of the Roman defeat at Cannae was not recognized in the early hours of the battle, nor even at its midpoint, but emerged gradually as space closed, movement slowed, and options disappeared. And this gradual realization mirrors many moments in history and life, where change arrives quietly rather than suddenly. Rome's experience at Cannae also reminds us that inevitability is rarely absolute, because while the battle's outcome became fixed once certain conditions were established, Rome itself was not undone, and the Republic's ability to absorb the lesson, without surrendering its identity, demonstrates that even inevitable outcomes can be integrated into longer narratives of growth and resilience. Hannibal's waiting, in this sense, was not about ensuring a final victory, but about creating a moment that would alter Rome's understanding of itself, forcing adaptation and reflection. And this deeper impact may be the most enduring consequence of the battle. As we step back from the details of formations and movements, Cannae becomes less a tale of ancient warfare and more a study in how systems behave under pressure, how confidence can both empower and constrain, and how patience can shape outcomes without direct confrontation. The calm reflection that Cannae invites is one that values awareness over speed, adaptability over certainty, and understanding over force, suggesting that the most decisive actions are often those taken long before a crisis becomes visible. In this way, the inevitability of Cannae was not tragic in the sense of being unavoidable from the beginning, but instructive, because it reveals how paths become fixed through repetition, assumption, and momentum, and how altering those paths requires not just strength, but insight. The Roman army marched in believing it was approaching resolution, and Hannibal waited, knowing that resolution would come through restraint. And between these two approaches, The battle unfolded as a quiet demonstration of how outcomes are shaped less by single moments than by sustained alignment of choices. As the dust settled on the plain of Cannae and the battle receded into history, what remained was not simply the memory of loss or victory, but a lasting invitation to consider how inevitability is created, recognized, and sometimes misunderstood. And this invitation continues to resonate because it speaks to enduring aspects of human behavior. Cannae reminds us that history often moves slowly until it suddenly feels complete, and that by the time an outcome becomes visible, the forces that shaped it have often been in motion for far longer than we realize, and it is within this slow movement, guided by waiting and marching alike, that the true meaning of Cannae resides, offering a quiet lesson that endures precisely because it does not shout, but waits to be understood. If you've made it all the way to the end, thank you for spending this time here, and for letting this quiet journey through the Battle of Cannae unfold at its own pace. If you found the story calming or meaningful, you're always welcome to subscribe to see new videos each week. Until next time, rest easy and take care.